Beneath the surface of history, where textbooks end and memory begins to blur, there lies a silence so heavy it feels deliberate. When you close your eyes and think of the past, you imagine stories neatly written, empires rising and falling in order, kings and queens traced in long, unbroken lines. But the truth is, that story is not whole. The truth is fractured. It has been bent, reshaped, even hidden, and sometimes it has been completely erased. The silence of history is not an empty silence. It is a silence filled with absence. It is the missing voices of civilizations that once thrived, whose languages are now dead on the wind. It is the disappearance of entire peoples who left no trace except for ruins swallowed by the earth. It is the burned scrolls of libraries, the torn-out pages of chronicles, the whispered myths that have survived only because they were carried in song or carved quietly into stone. This silence has not happened by accident. For every ancient story that has been lost, there is often a reason it was buried. Sometimes it was fire or war, sometimes it was conquest, and sometimes it was intentional. The rulers of the past knew the power of history. They knew that if they could control the story of yesterday, they could control the direction of tomorrow. So they silenced inconvenient truths. They buried rival gods. They erased dynasties, destroyed records, and destroyed temples so completely that we would forget they had ever existed. Think of it. We inherit the past not as it was, but as it has been allowed to survive. And that means what we call history may not be truth at all, but something more fragile, a story curated, edited, and concealed, a version of events someone wanted us to know. The silence of history haunts us because it feels unnatural. Human beings are storytellers. We long to remember, to pass knowledge forward. When we discover that whole chapters of our shared story are missing, we feel it, as if something is broken in us. We feel it in the ruins of cities that should not exist. We feel it in the mysteries of monuments whose builders are unknown. We feel it when timelines do not fit, when artifacts appear centuries before they should, when myths echo across cultures that were never supposed to have met. And in the quiet spaces between those fragments, we hear whispers of cover-ups, of truths that were buried so deeply we were never meant to dig them back up. Whispers of empires that may have lasted longer, reached farther, and held more power than the fragile records tell us. Whispers of secrets about humanity itself, about what we were once capable of and what we might have lost. This silence stretches across the ages. It reaches back into the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the forgotten millennia before written words. It sits in the dust of Mesopotamia, in the sands of Egypt, in the jungles of Mesoamerica. It lingers in standing stones, in glyphs carved into caves, in stories that still make no sense to us thousands of years later. Why does it haunt us? Because in that silence there is possibility. If the official story is not the whole truth, then what else might have been hidden? Could there have been knowledge far greater than we imagine? Could there have been civilizations more advanced than we have been told? Could the myths of gods, giants, floods, and lost lands have been more than just stories? The silence of history taunts us because we cannot answer these questions. We cannot go back. All we have are the fragments that survived, the bits and pieces left over from whatever was destroyed. We dig in the earth, we read the broken records, we try to fit the puzzle together, but no matter how hard we try, there are pieces missing on purpose. Perhaps that is why the cover-ups of the past still matter, because if someone, somewhere, once decided we were not meant to know, then maybe what they hid was the most important knowledge of all. Maybe they buried truths that could change the way we see ourselves, our origins, and our destiny. Maybe the silence of history is not just an absence, but a warning. As you drift deeper into this journey, remember, what we call history is not final. It is not complete. It is only what remains. And if the echoes of ancient cover-ups still reach us across thousands of years, then the silence of history has a voice after all, a voice that whispers to us in ruins, in myths, in mysteries, a voice that begs us to listen. And so, we begin. There are whispers of a civilization that once spanned continents, a culture so vast, so advanced, and so mysterious that its very existence has become one of the most hotly debated subjects of hidden history. Some call it myth, some call it conspiracy. And yet, across maps, ruins, and architecture that defies explanation, the name keeps returning: Tartaria. Imagine a world within our own world, a civilization that rose not in the shadows but in plain sight, then vanished almost completely. What remains of it are faint traces, curious symbols etched on forgotten globes, impossible buildings standing centuries before their time, and stories told in hushed tones that something monumental has been deliberately erased. The disappearance of Tartaria is not just about the vanishing of a people. It is about the vanishing of an entire possibility, an alternative history of humanity that may have stretched across Europe, Asia, and beyond. Ancient maps from the 16th, 17th, and even 18th centuries boldly mark vast regions as Tartary. This wasn't some obscure footnote. Cartographers across the world acknowledged it. And yet, today, the word is gone, replaced, corrected, as if the civilization itself was never meant to be remembered. What was Tartaria? Some believe it was an empire larger than Rome. Others claim it was not an empire at all, but a global network of cultures tied together by knowledge we cannot yet understand. Strange architecture remains scattered across cities and landscapes that do not fit neatly into the timelines we have been given. Buildings carved with precision, domes and towers, built with techniques we should not see in the periods they appear. Some stand abandoned, their origins forgotten. Others are still in use, repurposed, their true builders lost in silence. And then there are the legends of a great reset, stories of floods, fires, and events so catastrophic that they wiped out entire cultures. Was Tartaria erased by nature, or was it erased by design? Some believe powerful nations rose on its ashes, rewriting history to claim the world as their own. By erasing Tartaria, they erased a rival. They erased proof of a human story more complicated, more advanced, and more interconnected than we have been told. Listen to the silence around it. That silence speaks volumes. How does an empire, marked on maps for centuries, vanish so completely from textbooks, from lectures, from the very idea of history? How do thousands of years of culture simply dissolve into nothing but faint rumours and architectural anomalies? Perhaps Tartaria still haunts us because it represents something bigger than itself. It represents the possibility that our history is not just incomplete, but intentionally incomplete. That there were civilizations as powerful, or perhaps even more powerful, than the ones we celebrate today. Civilizations that left behind technologies, designs, and ways of life that challenge the straight, narrow line we've been given as human progress. And if Tartaria truly did exist, then what else has been hidden from us? Were they masters of energy we no longer understand? Did they hold secrets of architecture, sound, or light that we have yet to rediscover? Could their disappearance be tied to the sudden leaps and gaps in knowledge that appear in human history like breaks in a chain? Some say the evidence is right in front of us. The grand cathedrals that seem older than their official dates. The sprawling city plans that suggest a hand far greater than medieval builders. The ruins that echo across Siberia, Mongolia, and Central Asia, silent but immovable. These remnants hint at something, and yet we are told to dismiss them, to move on, to call it coincidence. But the silence around Tartaria is louder than denial, because every erasure leaves behind traces, a faint outline of what was, and what someone wanted us to forget. And perhaps that is why Tartaria continues to capture the imagination, not because we know the truth, but because someone, somewhere decided we should not. As you let the thought settle, remember this. The past is not lost, it is buried, and every cover-up leaves cracks through which whispers escape. Tartaria may be gone from maps, from classrooms, from the accepted story of who we are, but its shadow remains. A civilization erased from memory and yet not gone. Not completely, for what is erased can sometimes be recovered, and what is silenced can sometimes be heard again. Long before the rise of Rome, long before the glory of Greece, even before the pharaohs of Egypt etched their names into stone, there was another world, a world of ordered cities, wide streets, intricate drainage systems, and a people who seemed to master the art of living together in harmony. This was the Indus Valley civilization, a society so advanced for its time that even today it challenges our understanding of the ancient world. And then, almost as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. The Indus people left behind no great monuments to gods, no towering statues of kings, no epic tales carved in triumph. What they left was different. They left cities, cities that were planned with mathematical precision, streets laid out in grids, homes with wells and private baths, sewage systems that ran beneath the earth, more advanced than many societies thousands of years later. In Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, archaeologists uncovered brickwork so uniform, so carefully measured, it suggests not only skilled craftsmanship, but a culture bound by shared standards and rules. Imagine walking those streets 4,000 years ago, a city alive with merchants and families, farmers bringing goods from the countryside, artisans working metal, stone, and pottery, traders setting out for Mesopotamia and beyond. This was not a small village lost to time. This was a civilization thriving across hundreds of settlements, stretching over what is now Pakistan and northwest India. At its height, it was home to more people than Egypt or Mesopotamia, and yet it disappeared almost without a trace. There are no great records, no definitive texts. Their script, etched into seals and tablets, has never been fully deciphered. We can only guess at what they wrote. Their language remains silent, their voices forever sealed, and so we are left with fragments, ruins of cities, pieces of jewelry, broken tools, clues that tell us they were master planners, skilled engineers, and gifted traders, but clues that do not explain why their world collapsed. The disappearance of the Indus Valley civilization remains one of the most haunting mysteries of the ancient world. Was it drought that dried up their rivers? Was it flood that swept away their fields? Did invaders come, wiping them out and leaving silence in their wake? Or was it something even stranger? Something buried deeper, an erasure that was not just natural but intentional. Some scholars believe climate change played its hand, shifting the rivers that once sustained their agriculture. The mighty Saraswati, praised in later Indian texts, may have dried and vanished, leaving fields barren. Without water, the cities could no longer thrive. Others point to evidence of flooding in Mohenjo-Daro, bodies found in the streets as though struck by disaster and left where they fell. Still others whisper of conflict, of invaders pressing in from the north, scattering the people and erasing their cities from memory. Yet none of these theories fully satisfy. None explain how such a vast and organized civilization could disappear so completely, leaving behind no great legends, no remembered names. Egypt remembered its pharaohs. Mesopotamia remembered its kings. But the Indus? They are remembered only through silence. Perhaps that is the greatest cover-up of all. That the first great urban planners, the people who built cities so advanced they would not be rivaled for millennia, were allowed to fade into obscurity, their story untold, their achievements unacknowledged, their very identity lost in the dust of time. Even now their ruins whisper to us. The great bath at Mohenjo-Daro, still lined with bricks perfectly cut, speaks of ritual, of community, of people gathered for reasons we can only imagine. The seals carved with animals and symbols speak of a culture rich with meaning. The uniformity of their weights and measures speaks of a shared order, a society bound together. These were not savages fumbling in the dark of prehistory. These were visionaries, builders, planners. And then they were gone. The silence that followed their disappearance is deafening. For centuries no one spoke of them. Their cities lay buried under layers of earth, forgotten. It was only in the 1920s, when archaeologists uncovered Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, that the world realized what had been lost. The discovery rewrote the timeline of civilization, and yet, even now, so many questions remain unanswered. Perhaps their vanishing was not only a tragedy of nature or conquest, but also of memory. Perhaps those who came after chose not to remember. Perhaps their ways of life, their beliefs, their knowledge were too different, too threatening to the stories later civilizations wanted to tell about themselves. And so the first great urban planners of humanity were left in silence, their achievements buried under both soil and narrative. And so when we look at their ruins today, we are not just looking at bricks and stones, we are looking at the shadows of a people whose story was cut short. A reminder that history is not always a story of survival, but sometimes a story of disappearance. Sometimes the most advanced, the most peaceful, the most visionary are the ones we forget. And perhaps that is the true mystery of the Indus Valley. Not simply that they vanished, but that they were allowed to vanish. A cover-up not only by disaster but by time, by silence, by the willful erasure of memory itself. In the jungles of Mesoamerica, shrouded in thick vegetation and the weight of centuries, stand colossal stone heads, each one carved with striking detail, broad noses, full lips, helmets shaped like those of warriors. They stare silently across the land, guardians of a mystery we still cannot solve. These monuments belong to the Olmecs, a civilization that flourished long before the rise of the Maya or the Aztecs. They are often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica. And yet, like so many of history's deepest enigmas, their story is fractured, incomplete, and strangely obscured. The Olmec civilization appeared around 1500 BCE in the swampy lowlands of present-day Mexico. Without metal tools, without beasts of burden, they somehow carved and transported these massive basalt heads, some weighing as much as 40 tons. Imagine the hands that shaped them. Imagine the knowledge it would take to move such weight across miles of land, through rivers and dense forests. And yet, we are told to believe they were a primitive people fumbling at the dawn of culture. How then did they achieve what others could not? Their art suggests sophistication. Their cities reveal careful planning. Their symbols, etched into stone and jade, may represent the earliest writing system in the Americas. But so much about the Olmecs remains wrapped in silence. Unlike the Maya or the Aztecs, they left behind no great cities of stone that still stand proud against the sky. Their temples, their homes, their everyday lives, most of it is gone, lost to the elements, or perhaps erased by those who came after. The colossal heads remain, but even these are puzzles. Who do they represent? Were they kings, warriors, or deities? Their expressions are lifelike, their features distinct, as if they were portraits of real individuals. Some whisper that they may even hint at a more global connection, faces that look strangely unlike the native peoples recorded later in history. Could the Olmecs have known travellers from across the oceans? Could they have been connected to a wider world long before Columbus? The silence of history offers no easy answers, and yet traces of the Olmecs run like hidden veins through later Mesoamerican cultures. The jaguar god, the ball game, the use of rubber, and even certain calendar systems can be traced back to them. They were not an isolated people stumbling into civilization. They were innovators, inventors, builders. But then, around 400 BCE, they disappeared. Their great centers were abandoned. Their culture seemed to dissolve into the jungle, leaving later civilizations to carry pieces of their legacy while erasing their name. Why? Some suggest climate change. Rivers shifted, fields failed, and the people moved on. Others believe conflict tore their society apart, their monuments toppled by invaders. But there is another possibility, that their story was not merely forgotten but deliberately suppressed. That later civilizations, rising in their shadow, built their own myths and their own power on top of the Olmecs, burying their predecessors so deeply that even their true identity is lost. Consider this. We know the names of the Maya. We know the names of the Aztecs. But the Olmecs? That name was given to them much later, not what they called themselves. Their true name, their true identity, has been wiped clean. An entire civilization remembered only through a handful of massive heads and scattered artifacts. The enigma of the Olmecs is not only about who they were, but why we know so little. Why their story is left in fragments when it should have been celebrated as the foundation of an entire cultural world. It is as if someone carefully tore their pages out of history's book, leaving only faint shadows in the margins. And so we are left with giants in stone, staring across time with expressions we cannot read. Were they proud rulers immortalized in rock? Were they ancestors watching over generations yet to come? Or are they warnings, reminders carved by hands that knew their civilization was being erased, leaving behind monuments that could not be silenced? The Olmec enigma endures because it feels unfinished. We sense the weight of what has been lost. We see it in the colossal faces, in the symbols we cannot fully decipher, in the echoes that ripple through later cultures. The Olmecs stand as both the beginning and the missing piece of the story of Mesoamerica. And perhaps that is why their disappearance feels less like a natural fading and more like a cover-up, a deliberate silence, a culture that gave so much, yet remains unnamed, unrecognized, and hidden in plain sight. Their stone faces still watch us, their silence still speaks, and though their story may be buried, it has not been erased completely, for in every enigma there is a truth waiting to be uncovered. High on the mesas of the American Southwest, carved into cliffs and tucked into the walls of canyons, lie the remnants of a people who once thrived in the desert. Their homes are still there, stone dwellings that cling to the rock like nests, towers that rise against the sky, kivas carved into the earth for rituals we can only guess at. They are known today as the ancestral Puebloans, though once they were called the Anasazi. For centuries, they flourished in one of the harshest landscapes on earth, and then they walked away, entire cities, abandoned, entire lives left behind in silence. The Anasazi story is one of resilience. For hundreds of years, they built settlements across the Four Corners region, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. They mastered the desert, creating irrigation to bring water into their fields. They cultivated corn, beans, and squash, sustaining thousands of people in places where survival seems impossible. They were skilled artisans, leaving behind intricate pottery, woven textiles, and petroglyphs etched into stone. Their architecture still stuns us, massive complexes at Chaco Canyon, roads carved straight across the desert, cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde that rise like fortresses above the canyons. This was no scattered band of tribes. This was a civilization, a network of cities connected by trade, religion, and ceremony. At its height, tens of thousands of people called these places home. And yet, sometime around the 13th century, they were gone. Archaeologists walk through empty rooms still littered with grinding stones and tools, as though people had simply left one day and never came back. Fires went out. Fields went fallow. Roads that once carried pilgrims and traders grew quiet. The Anasazi vanished. Why? Theories abound. Some say drought gripped the land, drying rivers and cracking the earth until food became scarce. Others believe conflict tore their communities apart, with rival groups fighting for resources as the desert hardened against them. Still others suggest disease may have swept through, leaving silence in its wake. And then there are the whispers of something darker, something we are not meant to know. There are stories passed down through oral tradition, stories of violence, of cannibalism, of sudden upheaval, stories that paint the final days of the Anasazi not as a slow fading, but as a collapse marked by fear and desperation. Yet even these cannot fully explain why such vast settlements, spread across such a wide region, would all be abandoned around the same time. It feels less like a natural decline and more like a mass decision, a choice. as though one day the Anasazi stood together, looked at their homes, their cities, their sacred places, and decided to leave. But where did they go? Some say they migrated south, blending into other Pueblo cultures. Others believe they became the ancestors of modern tribes like the Hopi and the Zuni, carrying their traditions forward in secret. Yet the scale of their disappearance leaves us unsettled. It was not a small migration. It was the vanishing of a civilization. And so the mystery lingers. Were they forced to leave by environmental catastrophe or by something far more human? Were their cities abandoned because they could no longer survive or because they no longer wished to? Could it be that what they left behind, those towering cliff dwellings, those intricate roads, those sacred kivas, were not meant for us to understand at all? There is something haunting about walking through their ruins. The silence is heavy, as though the stones themselves remember, as though the walls are still waiting for the people who left to return. But they do not return, and perhaps they never will. The Anasazi mystery endures because it is not just about disappearance, it is about erasure. It is about how entire peoples can vanish, leaving behind only fragments that others interpret. Their own voices are gone, their language is gone. What we have are the echoes, the pottery, the carvings, the abandoned homes, and the eerie feeling that the full story is still hidden, waiting in the silence of the desert. When you stand at Mesa Verde and look into the cliff dwellings, you can almost imagine them. Children playing, fires burning, voices rising in ceremony, and then nothing. The wind sweeps through the empty rooms, the silence grows, and you are left with the unsettling realization that these people who once thrived in the desert, who built with skill and vision, are gone. A people who walked away and never returned. Perhaps they knew something we do not. Perhaps their disappearance was not just an ending, but a secret carried with them into the unknown. A cover-up of their own making. A choice to vanish, leaving only ruins and questions in their place. And that is why the Anasazi still haunt us, because their silence is not just the silence of history, it is the silence of people who chose to leave and never told us why. It was said to be the greatest library the world had ever known, a sanctuary of wisdom, a beacon for seekers, a place where the knowledge of countless civilizations was gathered under one roof, the Library of Alexandria. To speak its name is to summon both awe and sorrow, for it has become less a place in memory than a symbol of what humanity can achieve at its highest, and of how fragile that achievement truly is. The library rose in Egypt during the reign of the Ptolemies, after the death of Alexander the Great. It was not a simple collection of scrolls but a vision, an attempt to gather all the world's knowledge into one vast archive. Ships docking in Alexandria were searched, their manuscripts taken and copied, the originals kept in the library's vaults. Travellers brought texts from Greece, Babylon, India, China. Every discipline, every language, every corner of human understanding was welcomed. Philosophy, medicine, astronomy, history, mathematics. It was said the library held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, some claim as many as 1 million. Imagine walking through its halls, endless shelves of papyrus, the air heavy with the scent of ink and parchment. Scholars from across the known world gathered there, exchanging ideas, debating truths, writing works that would shape centuries to come. It was more than a building. It was a heartbeat, a place where humanity's memory was preserved, where wisdom was safeguarded against the erosion of time. And then it was gone. The details are lost in the haze of history. Some say Julius Caesar's soldiers set fire to the docks during the siege of Alexandria in 48 BCE, and the flames spread to the library. Others say it was later during the civil wars of Rome, or under the decree of Emperor Theodosius, or in the Arab conquest centuries after. No one can agree on how many times it may have burned or who struck the final blow. What we do know is this: the greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world was destroyed, and with it, an incalculable part of human history. Think about what was lost. Texts older than Greece, older than Egypt itself, perhaps even records of civilizations we no longer know by name. Medical knowledge, scientific theories, accounts of lands beyond the horizon, stories of gods and myths that might have linked cultures across the globe, secrets of engineering, astronomy, mathematics, all gone in smoke and ash. We will never know how far back our knowledge might have stretched had the library survived. We will never know what truths were buried in those flames. The silence that followed its destruction is almost unbearable. It is as though humanity suffered a kind of amnesia, a forgetting of who we were and what we once knew. We had to rebuild, to relearn, to start again in disciplines that may have already been mastered centuries before. The cover-up here is not deliberate, but it is no less complete. For fire is the cruelest editor. It does not leave behind partial truths. It leaves only absence. And yet, some wonder, was everything destroyed? Could fragments of the library's collection have survived, hidden in private collections, smuggled to other cities, preserved in secret? Some whisper that great powers, even today, hold manuscripts descended from those ancient scrolls, their contents too dangerous, too revolutionary to release. Knowledge that could alter our understanding of history, of science, of ourselves. The Library of Alexandria stands in our imagination as both a tragedy and a warning. It reminds us how fragile civilization is, how quickly brilliance can be undone. But it also reminds us of something deeper, that knowledge is power, and that power is never entirely safe. When we think of the library, we are haunted by a single question. What if? What if those scrolls had survived? What if the wisdom of ages had not been silenced by flame? What if we knew without doubt the true story of who we are? Instead, we are left with ash, with fragments of copies scattered across time, with echoes of works we cannot read, and with the haunting silence of what might have been the greatest treasure humanity ever possessed. The flames swallowed more than parchment. They swallowed memory. They swallowed possibility. They swallowed truths we were never meant to know. And in their absence, history became something else, something curated, reconstructed, reshaped from what little survived. The library's silence became a cover-up of its own, not because someone chose to erase it, but because once it was gone, those in power could shape the world's story in their image, without fear of contradiction. The Library of Alexandria still burns, not in fire, but in our imagination, and perhaps that is its truest legacy, a reminder that knowledge is fragile, that truth can vanish, and that silence can last longer than memory. In 1947, in the barren desert near the Dead Sea, a boy searching for a lost goat stumbled upon one of the most important discoveries in human history. Inside a cave sealed away for nearly 2,000 years lay jars filled with scrolls. Crumbling, fragile, yet still legible, these scrolls would ignite debates that continue to this day. They are called the Dead Sea Scrolls, and their contents are among the most haunting secrets ever pulled from the silence of time. The scrolls were written between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, at a time when empires rose and fell, when new religions were being born, when ancient traditions were shifting into forms we still recognize today. They were hidden carefully, placed in jars and tucked into caves around Qumran, as though someone knew they would be hunted, destroyed or lost. For 2 millennia they remained undisturbed, preserved by the desert air, until chance returned them to us. What do they contain? Fragments of nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible, hymns, prayers, rules of an ascetic community that lived apart from the world, writings that echo with apocalyptic visions, promising battles between light and darkness, foretelling a Messiah who would come to redeem the faithful. And then there are the texts that do not fit neatly into what we thought we knew. Books never included in the canon, ideas never taught in temples or churches. The Dead Sea scrolls are not simply ancient manuscripts. They are a window into a time of upheaval, a time when different groups vied for control of belief itself, shaping narratives, choosing which voices would be remembered and which would be silenced. Their discovery threatened to fracture the certainty of established history, because the scrolls reveal that the story of faith, the story we thought was unbroken, is far more complicated, contested, and concealed. From the moment they were found, secrecy surrounded them. For decades, only a handful of scholars were allowed to see them. Photographs were restricted, translations withheld. It was not until the 1990s that the wider academic world finally gained access. Why the delay? What truths were too dangerous to release? Some whisper that the scrolls contained teachings that challenged the very foundations of Christianity and Judaism. Others claim they revealed hidden sects whose beliefs were suppressed by those who came after. There are hints of connections to early Christianity, visions of a Messiah whose story echoes with startling familiarity. Was this the story of Jesus before his name was known, or was it another saviour, now erased? The silence around the scrolls fueled speculation. Were there prophecies too unsettling to reveal, writings that contradicted the established canon, evidence of ancient wisdom that powerful institutions feared? Even now, though much of the material has been published, gaps remain, sections so fragmented they cannot be fully reconstructed, fragments that vanish into secrecy. What makes the Dead Sea Scrolls so haunting is not just what they say, but why they were hidden. Someone, long ago, knew that their words were dangerous, knew they would be destroyed if found, and so they sealed them in jars and buried them in caves, hoping that one day the truth would resurface. That day came 2,000 years later. But are we any closer to knowing what they meant to preserve? The scrolls remind us that history is not a straight line. It is a battlefield of voices, some silenced, some amplified, some erased entirely. They show us that even sacred texts, even stories we consider eternal, were once choices made by people, for reasons we may never fully uncover. The cover-up is not in the scrolls themselves, but in what came after, the voices that were silent so others could reign supreme. When you imagine those caves at Qumran, you can almost feel the urgency of the people who hid them, the weight of fear, the sense that their truth was slipping away and their only hope was to bury it in the desert. What secrets did they believe they were protecting? And what might we have lost in the centuries of silence before their rediscovery? The Dead Sea Scrolls are a reminder that history is fragile, and that truth often lies hidden, waiting for the right moment to return. They are not just artifacts of the past, they are warnings. Warnings that what we know has been curated, shaped, and guarded. That for every story we are told, there are others we were never meant to hear. In the stillness of those caves, the scrolls waited. They waited while kingdoms rose and fell, while empires collapsed, while faith spread across the world. And when they emerged, they carried with them not just words, but the shadows of all that had been silenced, secrets hidden for millennia, secrets that still whisper to us across the centuries, daring us to listen. It was discovered carved into clay, etched in cuneiform script, one of the oldest forms of writing humanity ever created. At first glance, it appears to be what you might expect, a list of kings, dynasties, rulers who once governed the land of Sumer, the cradle of civilization. But as scholars began to read its contents, they realized this was no ordinary chronicle. This was the Sumerian king list, and the story it tells does not fit neatly into the timelines of history we've been taught. The list begins before the Great Flood. It speaks of cities that rose and fell, of rulers whose reigns stretched not for years or decades, but for centuries, thousands of years, in some cases tens of thousands. Kings who ruled longer than entire civilizations have existed. These were not mythic gods placed apart from men, but kings, human rulers described in the same breath as those who came later, their reigns recorded with precision. Imagine a king ruling for 30,000 years. Imagine a dynasty lasting longer than all of recorded history combined. To some, the king list is simply myth woven into memory, an attempt to link humanity's beginnings with the divine. To others, it is evidence of a time we are not meant to know, a time when humanity was different, when the line between man and God was blurred, when something walked among us that we no longer understand. After the flood, the reigns grow shorter, more familiar. Kings rule for decades, then for years, until finally the list aligns with what we know of history. Real rulers, real cities, Kish, Lagash. It is as though the king list straddles two worlds, one that is mythic, unreachable, almost impossible, and another that is grounded in archaeological fact. But why would the scribes record them together side by side if they did not believe it was all true? The mystery deepens when you realize that this is not the only tradition to speak of impossibly long-lived rulers before a flood. The Bible too speaks of patriarchs who lived for centuries: Methuselah, Noah, Adam. Ancient Egypt speaks of divine kings who ruled before the pharaohs. Myths from around the world echo with the same pattern: a golden age, a flood, a new beginning. Could it be coincidence? Or could these scattered voices be fragments of a deeper truth, a truth buried under millennia of denial? If the king list is myth, then why is it written in the same form, the same matter-of-fact tone as the later, historically verified rulers? If it was meant to be legend, why not separate it as myth and history are separated today? Instead, it flows seamlessly from kings who ruled for thousands of years to those who ruled for a handful, as though the scribes themselves saw no distinction. And what of the flood itself? The king list insists that there was a time before it, a time erased. Archaeology has revealed layers of flood deposits in Mesopotamia, evidence that ancient peoples may have lived through catastrophic deluge. Could this be the same event? Could it mark the dividing line between an age we are not allowed to remember and the age that we call history? Some suggest the long reigns were symbolic, exaggerations to glorify the past. Others whisper of something stranger, that perhaps the rulers themselves were not entirely human, that they were beings of a different kind with lifespans stretching beyond comprehension. If that is true, then the king list is not just a chronicle, but a confession, a record of contact, now disguised as legend. The silence surrounding it is telling. Few outside of specialist circles ever hear of the king list, despite its profound implications. It remains in the shadows of academic debate, carefully framed as mythology. But the stone tablets still exist, and they still whisper a story that refuses to be silenced. Imagine holding one of those tablets in your hand, the marks pressed into clay 4,000 years ago, preserving a memory that stretches far beyond what we believe possible. Imagine reading the names of kings who ruled for thousands of years, and knowing that someone, somewhere, thought this was the truth. The Sumerian king list is more than history. It is a fracture in the story we have been given, a reminder that our beginnings are not as simple as we want them to be, that perhaps there was a time before time, a forgotten chapter erased by flood and fire, remembered only by those who dared to carve it into clay. And as you let that thought settle, you realize why it haunts us. Because if the king list is true, even in part, then the story of humanity is far older, far stranger, and far more hidden than we have been allowed to believe. In the sands of Egypt in the late 19th century, fragments of a lost gospel were uncovered. Torn, incomplete, and hidden for centuries, it bore a name that shook the foundations of tradition. The Gospel of Mary, not Matthew, not Mark, not Luke or John, but Mary, a voice long silenced speaking across the gulf of time. For centuries, the story of early Christianity has been told in familiar tones. The Gospels chosen for the canon became the framework of faith, the lens through which millions would understand the life and teachings of Jesus. But outside those chosen texts, others existed, Gospels that told different stories, revealed different voices, offered glimpses of truths not sanctioned by councils and emperors. Among them, the Gospel of Mary is perhaps the most haunting, because it gives voice not to a disciple or apostle, but to a woman who in these pages is not a background figure, but a leader, a teacher, a bearer of hidden knowledge. The fragments we have suggest that Mary, often believed to be Mary Magdalene, speaks with authority. She comforts the disciples after Jesus' death, teaching them what he revealed to her in private. She speaks of visions, of the ascent of the soul, of a deeper knowledge hidden from the world. But her words were met with anger. The male disciples doubted her, questioned her right to speak, dismissed her testimony. Yet in the text her wisdom shines. It is as if we are hearing a suppressed voice, one that was meant to be forgotten. Imagine the weight of that silence. For nearly 2,000 years, Christianity was shaped without this gospel. Councils of bishops chose which texts would form the canon, which voices would become the foundation of faith, and which would be cast aside as heresy. The Gospel of Mary did not make the cut. It was hidden, destroyed, erased from memory. Why? Perhaps because it gave too much authority to a woman. Perhaps because it spoke of a path to the divine that bypassed the structures of church and power. Perhaps because it revealed a side of Jesus' teachings that was meant to remain in shadow. When the fragments were first studied, they caused a ripple of unease. Here was a gospel that challenged the very structure of authority in early Christianity. Here was a voice that refused to be silent, even though it had been buried. And yet, even today, many dismiss it as a curiosity, a fragment, an outlier. The silence continues, though cracks have appeared in its walls. The Gospel of Mary does more than challenge tradition. It reminds us that history is not only about what survived, but about what was chosen to survive. For every Gospel we read today, how many others were lost? For every voice we hear, how many others were silenced? The story of Christianity is not just a story of faith, but of selection, of editing, of erasure, and in the gaps left behind we can still feel the weight of what has been hidden. Consider this. If Mary Magdalene truly was a leader among the disciples, a teacher entrusted with secret knowledge, what does it mean that her voice was silenced? What does it mean that for centuries she was remembered not as a teacher but as a sinner? Could it be that the cover-up was not only about a text but about a person? That a woman who held authority was deliberately erased to fit a narrative of male power and hierarchy? The fragments of the gospel still whisper to us. They speak of inner vision, of the soul's journey beyond death, of a knowledge that is not confined to temples or priests but found within. They are words of liberation, words that suggest a faith deeper than rules, a truth greater than hierarchy. No wonder they were hidden, no wonder they were silenced. And yet, despite all efforts, they survived. Through fire, through persecution, through centuries of silence, scraps of papyrus remained. Enough for us to glimpse what was nearly lost. Enough to remind us that history is not whole, that the voices we hear are not the only voices that spoke. The Gospel of Mary is not just a text. It is a haunting reminder that silence itself can be deliberate, that what we know of the past is shaped not only by memory but by erasure, that the most dangerous truths may not be those shouted in the open but those whispered and then hidden away. And as you listen, you can almost hear her voice, calm, steady, speaking across centuries of silence, a woman whose words were once dismissed, but who could not be erased completely. Her gospel is incomplete, torn, fragmented, but even in pieces it carries weight. It carries the echo of a truth someone somewhere never wanted us to know. They are spoken of in whispers, fragments of legend scattered across centuries, bound to the name of Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes. They are said to contain the keys to all wisdom, the secrets of the cosmos, and the instructions for transforming both matter and spirit. They are the emerald tablets. Whether myth, metaphor, or hidden reality, they represent one of the most enduring mysteries of the ancient world. The story begins not with discovery, but with legend. Some say the emerald tablets were found in a hidden chamber beneath the Great Pyramid of Giza. Others claim they were revealed in Babylon, carried into Greece, preserved in the Arab world, and whispered into Europe during the Renaissance. Wherever their origin, the tablets have always been wrapped in secrecy. Their very name suggests permanence. Emerald, a stone that cannot be destroyed by time or fire. Words carved not on parchment or papyrus, but etched into eternity. The most famous of their teachings comes in a single phrase: as above, so below. A riddle of symmetry, of reflection, of the connection between the heavens and the earth, between the body and the spirit, between the seen and the unseen. This line alone has echoed through countless traditions, shaping philosophies, inspiring mystics, guiding alchemists. It suggests that the universe is not divided, but mirrored, that to understand the cosmos, one must understand the self, and to transform the self, one must understand the cosmos. But what was on the tablets? Some say they contained the science of alchemy, the secrets of turning base metals into gold, of mastering the forces of nature, of discovering the elixir of immortality. Others believe they were never about literal gold, but about spiritual transformation. The alchemists of the Middle Ages studied the tablets not just as recipes, but as allegories. To turn lead into gold was to turn the human soul from ignorance to enlightenment, from mortality to eternity. And yet, the origins of the emerald tablets remain shrouded. No ancient library records them. No archaeologist has uncovered them in stone. The earliest known versions appear in Arabic texts, translated into Latin in the 12th century, just as Europe began to emerge from its own dark age. Were they truly ancient, preserved for millennia before resurfacing? Or were they written later, disguised as ancient to lend them authority? The silence is telling. If they were fabrications, why do they feel so old? Why do they carry such resonance, echoing truths found in Egyptian wisdom, Greek philosophy, and even Eastern traditions? Could they have been fragments of a lost source, scattered across cultures, finally condensed into the form we know today? Or could they have been deliberately hidden, their knowledge passed only to those deemed worthy, resurfacing when the world was ready? Imagine for a moment that they were real, that words carved into green stone once held the keys to transformation. What knowledge might they have contained that we no longer possess? Secrets of energy, secrets of matter, clues to technologies now lost, wisdom erased by fire, flood, or deliberate suppression? If so, then the cover-up was not of myth, but of power. For knowledge that can transform humanity is knowledge that can also destabilize control. Even today, the emerald tablets inspire seekers. Mystics, philosophers, and even scientists find in them patterns, principles, questions that reach beyond time. They linger at the crossroads of science and spirituality, fact and myth, history and legend. They are not simply relics. They are symbols of something more, symbols of the possibility that truth is hidden, not destroyed. That wisdom is eternal, waiting beneath the layers of erasure. The mystery of the tablets endures because they refuse to be categorized. They are neither fully history nor fully myth. They stand between the two, haunting us with what might have been, with what might still be. Their silence is deliberate, their survival uncanny. And whether or not they ever existed as objects of emerald stone, their words continue to shape the way we see the world. The emerald tablets are a reminder that some truths are not meant for everyone. That knowledge has always been guarded, concealed, kept in the hands of the few, and that every cover-up leaves behind not just silence, but echoes that call us back again and again to mysteries we cannot explain. And so, the question lingers. Were the tablets a gift from gods, a creation of men cloaked in divine authority, or were they fragments of something far greater, preserved across ages, surviving every attempt to erase them? We may never know, but their whispers remain, and their silence, like so many ancient silences, is louder than words. They appeared like ghosts on the horizon, ships cutting across the Mediterranean waves, their sails dark against the sun. No one knew exactly where they came from. No one could say why they struck with such fury. But when they arrived, they left destruction in their wake, Cities burned, palaces fell, kingdoms crumbled. They were called the Sea Peoples, and their invasion shattered the Bronze Age world. To this day, their origin remains one of history's most unsettling mysteries. The Late Bronze Age was a golden era of empires: Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, great powers with trade routes stretching across seas, with armies, temples, and wealth. And yet, in the span of a century, almost all of them fell. Archaeologists walk through their ruins now, palaces charred, walls collapsed, inscriptions broken. What caused this collapse? Some say famine, some say natural disaster, but the ancient records tell another story. They speak of invaders from the sea, armies no one recognized, peoples whose names did not appear on maps, a shadow force that rose suddenly, struck mercilessly, and then seemed to vanish. Egyptian inscriptions carved on the walls of Medinet Habu tell of these enemies. Pharaoh Ramses III described wave after wave of warriors, arriving by land and sea, armed with strange weapons, wearing crested helmets, their ships swarming like locusts. Egypt fought them back in desperate battles, barely holding its ground. But other empires were not so fortunate. The Hittite kingdom collapsed. Cities across Greece fell silent. Trade routes that had connected the Mediterranean for centuries crumbled. Who were they? That is the question that haunts us. The names recorded in Egyptian texts, Sherdun, Shekelesh, Luka, Peleset, are echoes, fragments of peoples we cannot fully trace. Some scholars believe they were displaced migrants driven by famine or disaster to seek new lands. Others argue they were mercenaries turned conquerors, warriors united by desperation or ambition. But their sudden appearance and their devastating power suggest something more organized, more deliberate, a hidden hand in the collapse of civilizations. What makes the mystery of the Sea Peoples so chilling is the silence that surrounds them. For centuries they swept across the known world, and yet left no records of their own, no monuments, no chronicles, no home cities to point to. We know them only through the words of those who fought them, and those words are filled with terror. To the great kingdoms of the Bronze Age, the Sea Peoples were not just enemies, they were an ending. Imagine the panic of a world unraveling, traders arriving at empty ports, cities burned to ash, kingdoms that had stood for centuries collapsing in a single generation. To the survivors, it must have felt like the end of everything, and perhaps in a way it was. The collapse of the Bronze Age ushered in centuries of darkness. Literacy declined, trade routes vanished, populations shrank. What had once been a thriving network of civilizations became scattered and silent. Were the Sea Peoples the cause, or were they the symptom? Did they topple empires, or did they simply sweep through as empires were already crumbling from within? The truth is, we may never know. But what we do know is this: their shadow fell across the entire Mediterranean, and their mystery endures. Some believe they were precursors to later peoples we recognize, the Philistines of the Bible perhaps, or tribes that became part of Europe's later cultures. Others think they were a confederation of exiles, survivors of disasters we cannot trace, united only by necessity. But the lack of a clear answer is what gives their story its power. A nameless, faceless force that appeared out of nowhere and erased civilizations. What secrets were lost in that collapse? What knowledge vanished with the cities they burned? If the Bronze Age was a world of connection, of trade, of shared wisdom, then its destruction was not just political, it was intellectual. The Sea Peoples may have silenced more than empires. They may have silenced memory itself. Their invasion remains one of the greatest cover-ups in ancient history, not because we know what happened, but because we do not. The absence of their story is the cover-up. The silence they left behind has become louder than their actions. We search for their traces in shipwrecks, in pottery styles, in scattered bones. But the truth remains elusive. Picture those ships again, black against the sun, moving like shadows across the water. Picture the fear in the eyes of those who saw them approaching, knowing what followed, and picture the silence that came after, as entire civilizations fell into ruin, leaving only ruins and broken inscriptions to tell their tale. The sea peoples came from nowhere. They destroyed everything, and then they disappeared. A shadow army with no origin, still haunting the edges of history, reminding us that even the greatest civilizations are not immune to silence. History remembers victories. It remembers kings who triumphed, generals who carved their names into stone, armies that reshaped the world. But every so often, there are battles that leave behind no memory, no clear record, only ruins and whispers. Battles so devastating they erase not only armies but entire empires. One of these battles exists like a ghost in our collective past, an event so great it left silence in its wake. The battle that erased an empire. When archaeologists dig through the layers of forgotten cities, they sometimes find signs of sudden destruction. Burned walls, arrowheads buried in the dust, skeletons scattered where they fell. These ruins tell of violence, of conquest, of conflict so intense that entire civilizations collapsed in its shadow. Yet, in some cases, the written record is gone. No victor claimed the glory. No poet sang of the defeat. The war existed, but the memory of it did not survive. One such mystery lies in Anatolia, in the ruins of the once mighty Hittite Empire. At their height, the Hittites rivaled Egypt itself. They built cities of stone, commanded armies of chariots, signed treaties that still survive on tablets today. And then they vanished. Their capital, Hattusa, burned and abandoned. Their empire crumbled almost overnight. What could destroy such a power so completely? We know of no single battle, no decisive war, and yet the ruins tell us that something happened, something catastrophic. It is as though an entire war has been erased. Was it the sea peoples, striking in waves that left nothing behind but fire and silence? Was it an invasion from neighbours hungry for land and power? Or was it a rebellion from within, a civil war so brutal that the empire collapsed under its own weight? The silence around it suggests something deeper, a cover-up of failure, a memory deliberately left unspoken, because in the ancient world, to admit defeat was to admit weakness, and so, perhaps the story of the battle was buried with the empire itself. Consider also the Mycenaeans of Greece. They too collapsed in the late Bronze Age, their palaces burned, their culture reduced to fragments. Later generations remembered a war, the Trojan War, sung in epic poetry. But was this a memory of a single conflict, or an echo of something far greater? Could Homer's verses be shadows of a war that was never meant to be remembered in full? A war that ended not just a city, but an age? The battle that erased an empire does not exist in one place. It is a pattern. Again and again, we find traces of wars that should be famous yet are nameless. Wars that reshaped the ancient world but left behind no record of how or why. Imagine the survivors of such a battle, scattered, broken, carrying fragments of memory, but no written words. Imagine them rebuilding, their children forgetting, their grandchildren repeating only stories in half-remembered myth. Over time, the war becomes a shadow, a legend, and finally, nothing at all. The silence is not accidental. Silence can be as deliberate as fire. Victors erase their enemies from history. Defeated peoples bury their shame. Empires destroyed so completely can no longer tell their side of the story. What remains is absence. The absence of names. The absence of dates. The absence of truth. And yet, when we look at the ruins, we know. We know there was a battle. We know there was a war. We know that something so powerful, so decisive, unfolded that it ended civilizations. Even if the records are gone, the earth remembers. The stones remember. The skeletons lying in the dust remember. The battle that erased an empire is not only about one event, it is about the fragility of memory itself. How easily history can be undone, how quickly glory can vanish, and how even the greatest powers can be reduced to silence. When you walk through the ruins of Hattusa or Mycenae or any number of cities lost in the late Bronze Age, you feel it, the quiet, the stillness, the weight of something that was once vast, now reduced to rubble. You realize that history is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it is not written at all, and that is what makes this battle so haunting. It exists only in absence, in erasure, in the things that are no longer there. It is the missing war. The war that ended an empire but left no words behind, only ruins, only silence. And in that silence we hear the truth. What we call history is only what survived. The rest, no matter how great, has been swallowed by time. It is one of the most famous wars in history, or perhaps in myth. The clash between Greeks and Trojans, immortalized in Homer's Iliad, has echoed across centuries. Heroes like Achilles and Hector, kings like Agamemnon and Priam, and the fateful beauty of Helen, the face that launched 1,000 ships. But beneath the poetry, beneath the legends of gods interfering in human affairs, there lingers a darker question. Did the Trojan War truly happen? And if it did, what truths have been hidden in the shadows of myth? Archaeologists point to the ruins of Troy in modern-day Turkey as proof that something lay behind the legend. The city was real. It was built and destroyed multiple times, layers upon layers of walls and ashes, each representing a different age. And in one of those layers, around the 12th century BCE, there is evidence of fire, of siege, of sudden collapse. Could this have been the war Homer described? Or was it only one of many battles later magnified into epic poetry? The Iliad is not a history book. It is poetry, written centuries after the war it claims to describe. Its verses are filled with gods who guide arrows, who whisper into the ears of kings, who decide fates on the battlefield. Yet, within the divine chaos, there are glimpses of something more human, more plausible. The quarrel over trade routes, the struggle for power between emerging Greek kingdoms and the wealthy city that guarded the straits to the Black Sea. Behind the poetry of love and vengeance may lie the oldest story of all, war for profit, war for control. But if the Trojan War was real, why cloak it in myth? Why hide its truths in verse? Perhaps because myth was safer. Myth could disguise uncomfortable truths, betrayal, brutality, the real reasons nations went to war. A tale of gods and heroes is easier to tell than the story of greed, conquest, and suffering. Perhaps the truth was too dark, too ordinary, and so it was buried beneath legend. And then there is the question of the horse, the famous wooden horse that brought down a city. Was it real? Was it a trick, a gift hiding soldiers in its belly? Or was it something else entirely? Some believe the horse was a metaphor, a siege engine, a battering ram, or even an earthquake symbolized by Poseidon's sacred animal. Whatever it was, the story survived not as fact but as symbol, transformed by time into myth. The Trojan War, whether truth or legend, has shaped Western memory, yet its very persistence raises a troubling thought. If it was simply myth, why did it matter so much? Why did generations cling to it as though it carried echoes of a deeper memory? And if it was history, why has it been disguised so carefully? Perhaps that is the real cover-up. Not whether the Trojan War happened, but what it truly was. Was it one battle among many, later elevated into legend? Was it the collapse of an entire age, retold through the lens of one city's fall? Or was it a real war remembered imperfectly, twisted until only fragments of the truth remain? As you imagine the walls of Troy rising out of the plain, imagine also the silence. The cries of the fallen long faded, the fires long extinguished, the heroes reduced to names. The ruins tell us only that a city burned. The poetry tells us only that men and gods quarreled. The truth lies somewhere between. And in that space between myth and history, the Trojan War remains. It may have been real, it may have been legend, but perhaps it was both. A truth so dark it could only survive in myth. A memory so haunting it could only be disguised as poetry. A war that was more than a war. And so, when we speak of the Trojan War, we are not simply retelling Homer, we are confronting a silence that hides not only the fate of one city, but the shadow of an age that ended in fire. Flood myths flow through the memory of nearly every ancient culture, from Mesopotamia to India, from the highlands of Central America to the islands of the Pacific. There are stories of water rising, of worlds drowned, of humanity nearly extinguished before beginning again. They are told in different languages with different names and details, but their patterns are eerily familiar. A great flood, a chosen survivor, the preservation of life, and then a new world rising from the waters. Were these simply myths, symbolic tales meant to explain nature's fury? Or do they preserve the memory of a real catastrophe, one so vast it shook the entire human story? The Sumerians were among the first to write it down. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim is warned by the gods to build a great boat to save his family and animals, for a flood is coming that will destroy humanity. He survives, the waters recede, and life begins anew. Centuries later in the Hebrew Bible, Noah received a similar warning. He too builds an ark, survives the flood, and restores life to the earth. In India, ancient Vedic texts tell of Manu, guided by a fish who warns him of rising waters. In Greek tradition, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive by floating in a chest until the flood subsides. Across the ocean, in the Americas, native peoples tell of water swallowing the land, leaving only a few survivors clinging to mountains or rafts. How could so many cultures separated by oceans and mountains tell the same story? Coincidence seems unlikely. Were they simply explaining the universal experience of floods, natural and devastating, or were they recording the memory of one event, an ancient catastrophe that scarred the human mind so deeply it was never forgotten? Geologists point to the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago. Ice sheets melted, seas rose dramatically, entire coastlines disappeared. What is now the Black Sea may once have been a fertile plain suddenly swallowed by the sea. Coastal cities, if they existed, would have been drowned, leaving their ruins hidden beneath the waves. Could this be the source of the great flood stories? A memory of rising waters passed down through generations, transformed into myth? But there are other whispers too. Whispers of cataclysms not caused by melting ice, but by something far more sudden. Some suggest a comet impact, striking the earth and unleashing chaos, fires, floods, storms. Others imagine seismic shifts, tsunamis that swept across continents, burying civilizations that we no longer remember. Whatever it was, the memory of drowning survived. It survived in temples, in scripture, in story. And yet, the flood myths are not only about destruction, they are also about renewal. Each tale speaks of a remnant saved, of life beginning again, of humanity reborn. It is as if our ancestors wanted to remind us that endings are not final, that from catastrophe something new can rise. Still, we cannot ignore the silence beneath the stories, the silence of civilizations that may have been lost forever, their names, their knowledge, their very existence drowned. Was the flood a cover-up of sorts? A natural cover-up, burying cities beneath oceans, erasing entire cultures from the land we now walk? Or was it something else? Did survivors deliberately disguise their memory as myth, encoding truth in story, knowing that the details would be lost, but the warning would remain? Perhaps the flood myths are not just tales of the past, but messages to the future, warnings that the world can be undone in a single generation. When you listen to these stories side by side, the similarities are chilling: a divine warning, the construction of a vessel, the salvation of life, the return of order after chaos. If they are all allegory, it is a strangely universal allegory. If they are memory, then what they recall is nothing less than the collapse of the world as it once was. Picture it: oceans swelling, rains that did not stop, rivers bursting from their beds, entire landscapes disappearing beneath water. Picture the survivors, watching everything they knew vanish, carrying only their stories with them. And then, Imagine those stories carried forward for thousands of years, reshaped but never erased, until they reached us as myth. The Great Flood stories remind us that what we call myth may not be fiction at all. It may be memory, ancient, distorted but real, a memory of catastrophe, of survival, of humanity starting over, and perhaps of civilizations that once thrived, only to be lost beneath the waves. In the storerooms of a museum in Baghdad, an object once sat unnoticed. At first glance it appeared simple, a clay jar sealed with asphalt, containing a copper cylinder, and inside that an iron rod. It was found near the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, dating back over 2,000 years. To most it looked unremarkable, but when modern eyes studied it, a chilling possibility emerged. This could have been a battery, a device capable of generating electricity long before electricity was supposed to exist. It has come to be known as the Baghdad battery. The idea seems impossible. Electricity, as we understand it, was not harnessed until the modern era. The science of it belongs to Franklin, Volta, and Edison. Yet here was an object, crude but functional, that when filled with an acidic liquid, like vinegar or lemon juice, produced a current, enough to give a mild shock, enough perhaps to plate metals with gold or silver, enough to suggest that the ancients knew more than we give them credit for. If true, the implications are staggering. What else might they have discovered? What other knowledge might they have possessed that has since been lost or buried? Was this jar a curiosity, an isolated experiment, or was it evidence of a technology that has been deliberately erased from the record? Some scholars dismiss it as coincidence. They argue it was merely a container for scrolls, or for sacred texts, or even for holding medicines. They say the resemblance to a battery is misleading, but if that were true, why does it function so perfectly when reconstructed? Why does it mirror the same principles discovered millennia later by scientists who had no knowledge of such an object? The Baghdad battery is not alone. In other parts of the world, strange artifacts have been unearthed that suggest ancient peoples may have brushed against technologies we believe to be modern. In Egypt, gilded objects appear to have been plated in a way that could require electrochemical processes. In Greece, the Antikythera mechanism shows an understanding of gears and astronomy so advanced it rivals medieval clocks. Again and again, fragments appear that whisper of a forgotten knowledge. And yet, these artifacts rarely make it into mainstream accounts of history. They are dismissed as anomalies, explained away, or quietly ignored. Why? Perhaps because to accept them would be to rewrite everything we believe about the past. To admit that the ancients may have had a grasp on forces we think we discovered only yesterday. To accept that history is not a straight line of progress, but a series of rises and collapses where knowledge is gained, lost, and sometimes hidden. Imagine ancient priests holding a jar that glowed faintly when connected to another device. Imagine artisans using electroplating to cover common metals in gold, creating treasures that dazzled but concealed the method of their making. Imagine knowledge passed down in secret, guarded not for the benefit of all but for the power of the few. And then imagine it vanishing, erased by conquest, destroyed by war, buried by time. The Baghdad battery remains a riddle because it does not fit the story we tell ourselves. It suggests that human ingenuity stretches farther back than we allow. It suggests that what we call modern is perhaps rediscovery. And it suggests that somewhere, hidden in the ruins and silences of history, lies a far older understanding of the natural world. Some believe the knowledge was deliberately suppressed, that ancient technologies, whether batteries or other devices, were locked away or destroyed to prevent them from threatening the structures of power. After all, knowledge is dangerous, knowledge empowers, and those who held authority in ancient times may have chosen to bury discoveries that could upend their control. When you look at the Baghdad battery, you see more than a jar. You see a crack in the story of history, a reminder that progress is not as linear as we want to believe, a warning that what we think we know may only be a fragment of the truth, and so it sits, half forgotten, its secret still humming quietly beneath the surface. Was it really a battery? Or was it something even stranger, something we can no longer imagine? We may never know, but its silence speaks volumes. It tells us that history is not complete, that there are discoveries we were never meant to inherit, that electricity itself may have flickered in human hands long before the modern age, only to be buried in clay and forgotten. The Baghdad battery is a relic of possibility, a reminder that the past is not as dark as we think, but perhaps far brighter, if only we had not covered its light. In 1901, off the coast of a small Greek island called Antikythera, divers searching for sponges stumbled upon the wreck of an ancient ship. Among statues, pottery, and coins, they found a corroded lump of bronze and wood broken into fragments. At first it looked like nothing more than debris, but hidden within were gears, intricate interlocking gears crafted with precision no one believed possible in the ancient world. When the fragments were studied, a shocking truth emerged. This was a machine, a device so advanced it has been called the world's first computer, the Antikythera mechanism. Dated to around the 2nd century BCE, the mechanism could predict the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets. It tracked eclipses. It modelled the cycles of the heavens with astonishing accuracy. When reconstructed, it revealed a system of gears more complex than anything seen again for over 1,000 years. Medieval clockmakers would struggle to match its sophistication. And yet, here it was, built in an age when history tells us such technology should not exist. Who made it? And how was the knowledge lost? The Greeks were skilled astronomers, yes, they watched the skies carefully, mapping the patterns of stars. But to transform observation into machinery of this caliber requires more than knowledge. It requires metallurgy of the highest order. It requires tools capable of cutting gears with microscopic precision. It requires mathematics that go beyond simple calculation. It requires a leap we cannot account for in the timeline we've been given. The Antikythera mechanism forces us to confront a possibility most historians resist, that our ancestors knew more than we allow, that they touched on discoveries that were later buried, forgotten, or deliberately erased. This machine should have changed the world. Instead, it vanished into the sea, taking with it the memory of its makers. Why do we not hear of dozens like it? If one was built, surely others existed. Were they destroyed when libraries burned, when empires fell, when conquerors sought to silence the wisdom of their rivals? Or were they kept hidden, their knowledge guarded by secret circles who understood the power of controlling the heavens? There are hints in ancient texts of devices like this. The writings of Cicero mention a mechanism built by Archimedes, capable of predicting the motions of the heavens. Was the Antikythera mechanism a descendant of his genius? Or was Archimedes himself heir to a tradition of engineering that reached back even farther, into civilizations we no longer remember? The silence is unsettling, because it suggests that history is not a steady climb, but a cycle of brilliance and forgetting. That knowledge can appear, shine brightly, and then vanish, leaving us to rediscover it centuries later as if it were new. How many other machines, how many other breakthroughs were lost to time, erased by fire, flood, or deliberate cover-up? Imagine standing on that ancient ship, watching sailors carry the device aboard, its gears turning silently, the future written in bronze. Imagine them consulting it before voyages, reading the heavens not only with their eyes, but with a machine that captured the cosmos itself. And then imagine the shipwreck, the machine sinking beneath the waves, its knowledge buried for 2,000 years. When the fragments were first studied, scientists dismissed them. Too complex, they said, too advanced for its time. It was only decades later, with X-rays and modern reconstructions, that the truth became undeniable. The Antikythera mechanism was real. And it should not have been. That is what makes it so haunting, because it forces us to ask, what else lies beneath the sea, beneath the soil, waiting to rewrite everything we think we know? What other stories have been erased, their evidence scattered, leaving us only fragments? The Antikythera mechanism is not just a machine, it is a wound in history, a reminder of what was lost and what was hidden. We call it the world's first computer, but perhaps it was not the first at all. Perhaps it was only the last survivor of a knowledge too great to be remembered. And when you hear the gears turning in your mind, when you imagine the hands that built it, you realize the truth. The past was not primitive, it was brilliant, and its brilliance has been covered over with silence. They rise from the earth like questions carved into stone. The pyramids. At Giza, they dominate the desert, their edges aligned with uncanny precision, their mass so immense it seems to defy imagination. In Mexico, they rise from jungles swallowed by roots and time, yet still standing as if untouched by centuries. In South America, they crown mountain valleys. Across the world, from China to Sudan, from the sands to the forests, pyramids appear again and again. Different cultures, different ages, but the same shape, an eternal symbol of power, of mystery, of something beyond what we can fully explain. The Great Pyramid of Giza is the most famous. Constructed more than 4,000 years ago, its stones weigh tons, yet they are fitted together with such precision that even today, a blade of metal cannot easily slide between them. It was aligned to the cardinal points with an accuracy that rivals modern instruments. Its base is nearly perfect, its proportions echoing sacred geometry. To this day, no one fully understands how it was built. Ramps, pulleys, teams of thousands. Explanations abound, yet none satisfy. How could a society without modern cranes, without steel tools, without wheels, construct something that still towers as one of the greatest feats of engineering ever achieved? And then there is the question of purpose. We are told they were tombs, but no body has ever been found in the Great Pyramid. No inscriptions line its walls, no treasures were buried within. Instead, its chambers echo with silence. Theories abound. Was it a tomb? Was it a temple? Was it a power plant of some kind, harnessing energy through stone and geometry? Some whisper that it was a monument not to death, but to knowledge itself. The mystery deepens when you realize pyramids are not unique to Egypt. The Maya and the Aztecs built them, step pyramids that rose into the sky as temples and observatories. In China near Xi'an, giant pyramids lie hidden beneath earth and vegetation, some said to dwarf Giza in scale. Across Sudan, hundreds of smaller pyramids rise from the sand, remnants of the Nubian kingdoms. Even in Europe, mounds and structures shaped in pyramid form appear older than recorded history. Why did so many cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, choose the same form? Coincidence, or something more? Some believe pyramids were more than monuments, that they were machines of stone, capturing and channeling energy from the earth, from the heavens, from forces we no longer understand. Their shapes mirror the constellations above. Their alignments mark solstices, equinoxes, the paths of stars. The ancients, we are told, did not have advanced instruments, yet they measured the heavens with accuracy modern astronomers still respect. Did they possess knowledge we have since forgotten, or were they inheritors of wisdom passed down from a civilization older than we admit? The cover-up lies not in the stones themselves, but in the explanations we are given. We are told these structures were simple tombs. We are told their builders worked with primitive tools, dragging stones across sand. But the structures themselves seem to whisper otherwise. Their precision, their durability, their echoes in myth and memory suggest something greater, something that perhaps we are not meant to know. Imagine the builders standing in the desert night, stars blazing above them. Imagine their hands shaping stone, not just for survival but for connection, for aligning heaven and earth, for binding the human story to the cosmos. These were not simply monuments to kings, they were monuments to knowledge, to mystery, to power. And as we walk among them today, we feel the weight of what has been lost. Why does the pyramid endure? Because it is not simply a shape, it is a riddle. It suggests that our ancestors were not stumbling in darkness, but reaching towards something profound. That the civilizations we call primitive may have been more advanced than we allow. That history has been rewritten, their brilliance hidden beneath a story of tombs and slaves. The pyramids remain, vast and silent, guardians of secrets carved into stone. We cannot ignore them. We cannot explain them, and we cannot erase them. They stand as reminders that the past is deeper, stranger, and more powerful than the story we have been told. And as the stars wheel overhead, casting their ancient light across those stones, the pyramids seem almost alive, as if they are still watching, still waiting, as if their silence is not empty at all, but filled with truths we were never meant to uncover. High on the walls of temples, etched into stone, carved into artifacts thousands of years old, there are images that should not exist. Winged figures soaring above mortals, strange shapes that resemble aircraft, small golden objects, aerodynamic in design, discovered in Colombia, reliefs from Egypt that show what appear to be helicopters, planes, even rockets. These are fragments of a forgotten dream, or perhaps fragments of a forgotten reality. They suggest that in the deep past, long before the Wright brothers lifted from the sands of Kitty Hawk, humanity may have already known the secret of flight. The idea is unsettling because it does not fit. Our timeline tells us that flight is recent, a triumph of modern engineering. Yet when we look at these ancient depictions, we see something far older, something that should not be there. The Tolima figurines of Colombia, small golden artifacts shaped like birds at first glance, reveal details that birds do not possess: stabilizers, tail fins, wings set at angles designed for lift. Engineers who built models of these artifacts discovered they could fly, gliding through the air with stability. Were they toys, symbols, or were they miniatures of something that once really existed? In Egypt, at the temple of Seti Wom in Abydos, a panel of hieroglyphs shows shapes that resemble modern machines. One looks uncannily like a helicopter, another like a jet, another like a tank. Scholars dismiss it as a palimpsest, an accidental layering of symbols over time that only appear to form these shapes. But when you see them, the resemblance is startling, too clear to ignore. Did the Egyptians imagine these forms by chance? Or were they recalling something they had seen, something passed down in memory? And then there are the stories. Ancient Indian texts like the Vedas and Mahabharata describe flying machines called vimanas. They are said to soar through the sky, carrying warriors and kings powered by forces we cannot identify. These texts describe battles in the air, weapons of terrifying power, machines that could travel vast distances. Are these purely mythological? Or are they memories of technologies long lost, wrapped in the language of gods to disguise their origins? The cover-up, if there is one, lies in the refusal to consider these possibilities. Mainstream history insists that flight belonged only to our modern era, that the ancients, no matter how brilliant, had no access to the skies. Yet across cultures, across centuries, the same theme returns: carvings, stories, artifacts, all whispering the same thing. Humanity once looked upward, and perhaps we soared. If ancient flight was real, what happened to it? Why was it lost? Was it knowledge reserved for a few, hidden within priesthoods and mysteries, never shared with the masses? Was it destroyed in catastrophe like so much else in the great collapses of history? Or was it deliberately buried, erased so that later generations would believe themselves to be the first, the greatest, the pinnacle of human achievement? Imagine a world where flight was rediscovered, not invented. Imagine that the skies had already been conquered once before, only to fall into silence. Imagine the ruins of forgotten civilizations, their machines crumbled into dust, their knowledge lost in libraries that burned. And yet hints remain, enough to make us wonder, enough to remind us that history is not as simple as we have been told. The carvings and artifacts may be fragments, but fragments are all we ever find of the deepest past. And in those fragments lies possibility. Stand before the Tolima figurines. Look at the precision of their form. Stand before the walls of Abydos. Look at the shapes that should not exist. Read the ancient texts of India. Hear the voices describing battles in the skies. Alone, each may be dismissed. Together they form a pattern too striking to ignore. What if our ancestors once touched the skies only to fall back to earth? What if their machines, their discoveries, their understanding of the forces of nature were silenced, erased, forgotten? What if the dream of flight is not new at all, but a memory struggling to return? The carvings that suggest man once soared may not be proof, but they are not nothing. They are whispers of something lost. They are questions carved into stone, hidden in gold, preserved in ancient words. They remind us that the past is not closed, that there are still stories buried in silence, and that perhaps long ago humanity looked to the heavens and did not just dream but flew. In the long line of Egypt's pharaohs, carved into stone and remembered for millennia, there is one who stands apart, a ruler whose reign was unlike any before or after, a man who dared to rewrite the religion of Egypt, to silence the gods of his ancestors, and to proclaim that only one god should be worshipped. His name was Akhenaten, and yet, when his reign ended, his memory was attacked with a fury rarely seen in history. His statues were smashed, his temples destroyed, his name chiseled from monuments. It was as if Egypt itself wanted him to vanish. Before Akhenaten, Egypt was a land of many gods: Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, divine figures whose stories shaped the rhythm of daily life. Temples rose to honor them, priests wielded power in their names, and the pharaoh was the living link between gods and people. But Akhenaten saw something different. He elevated one god above all others, Aten, the radiant sun disk, the visible light of the heavens. For him, Aten was not just another deity in the crowded pantheon. Aten was everything. This was more than a change in ritual. It was a revolution. Akhenaten closed temples to the old gods, stripped priests of their power, and commanded that Egypt worship Aten alone. He built a new capital city, Akhetaten, the horizon of Aten, where temples to the sun disk glowed with light. He composed hymns to Aten, praising the god not as a distant figure but as the source of all life, pouring warmth and power over the earth. In these hymns some hear echoes of monotheism long before it spread across the world. Was Akhenaten the first to glimpse the idea of one god? Was his revolution a spark that would later ignite in other lands, in other faiths? Or was he simply a heretic, a dreamer who sought to reshape the cosmos according to his own vision? What is certain is that Egypt did not forgive him. After his death, his city was abandoned, his monuments torn down, his name scratched from king lists. Later pharaohs, including the famous Tutankhamun, his own son, restored the old gods and erased Akhenaten's revolution. For centuries, his story was forgotten, buried under sand and silence. Only in the 19th century, when archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Amarna, did his face emerge again from the shadows. But even in fragments, his memory unsettles us. His images look strange, unlike other pharaohs: elongated heads, narrow faces, almost androgynous forms. Some scholars suggest it was artistic style, meant to emphasize his closeness to the divine. Others whisper about deformities, diseases, or something stranger. Was Akhenaten deliberately depicted as otherworldly to separate him from mortal men? Or was he truly different in ways we cannot explain? The erasure of Akhenaten is as fascinating as his reign itself. Few rulers in history have been so thoroughly attacked after death. Egypt's scribes called him the criminal. His city was left to crumble, his temples looted for stone. The message was clear: he was not meant to be remembered. But if his revolution was so dangerous that it had to be erased, what truth did it hold? Perhaps his vision of one god was a threat to the priesthood, stripping them of centuries of power. Perhaps it was political, a way to centralize devotion around the pharaoh himself, making him the sole mediator between Aten and the people. Or perhaps it was something else, something more profound. Did Akhenaten glimpse a truth that others wanted hidden? Did he see a unity at the heart of existence, a divine source that would challenge not only Egypt's gods but every system of power built on them? What makes his story haunting is not only his boldness but the silence that followed. For thousands of years his name lay buried, his city was swallowed by desert winds. And yet, when his ruins were uncovered, the fragments still spoke. They spoke of a pharaoh who dared to dream differently, a ruler who turned his face to the sun and declared that there was only one light worth following. Akhenaten's erasure was not complete. It never is. For every name chiseled away, for every statue broken, there remain echoes. His hymns to Aten still survive. His likeness, though defaced, still gazes across time. And his story lingers, unsettling and unresolved. Was he a heretic, a madman, a visionary, or the first prophet of a new age? We may never know. But perhaps that is why his memory was buried so furiously, because the most dangerous truths are not those we forget, but those that refuse to stay forgotten, and Akhenaten, even erased, still whispers across the silence of history. She has been remembered as the seductress, a temptress, a queen who brought empires to ruin with her beauty. Cleopatra. Her name conjures images of luxury, of Rome's greatest generals falling at her feet, of a woman who weaponized desire. But that is not her true story. That is the story Rome wanted the world to remember. The real Cleopatra, the queen who ruled Egypt with intelligence, strategy, and political brilliance, was buried beneath centuries of slander. Her life was rewritten by her enemies, and the legend that survives is as much a cover-up as it is history. Cleopatra was the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, descended not from Egypt's native pharaohs but from the Greeks who had followed Alexander the Great. Yet she embraced Egypt more than many of her predecessors. She learned its language, the first Ptolemy to do so. She adopted its gods, its rituals, its culture, becoming not just a foreign ruler but a pharaoh in truth. She reigned over a nation caught between two giants, Rome in the west and Parthia in the east, and for nearly 2 decades she kept Egypt independent through diplomacy, cunning, and sheer will. The Romans feared her, not simply because she was queen, but because she was clever. She understood politics as well as any man in her age. She formed alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony, not only as lovers, but as partners in strategy. To Rome, this was dangerous. A woman who commanded men, who dared to challenge their dominance, could not be remembered as she was. And so they crafted another story. They painted her as a harlot, a manipulator, a queen whose power lay not in her mind, but in her beauty. Yet the evidence tells us otherwise. Cleopatra was multilingual, speaking as many as 9 languages. She studied philosophy, mathematics, medicine. She was not merely ornamental, she was formidable. Coins from her reign bear her face, not idealized into perfection, but depicted with strength, intelligence, and authority. In Egypt she was beloved. To her people she was not a seductress, but a sovereign defending their land against the tide of empire. But when Rome triumphed, it was Rome's version of her story that survived. Octavian, later Augustus, needed to justify his conquest of Egypt. He needed to frame his victory not as the crushing of a nation, but as the liberation of Rome from the spell of a dangerous woman. And so, Cleopatra became the villain, the queen who had ensnared Antony, the queen whose ambitions threatened Rome, the queen whose downfall was inevitable. This was propaganda, carefully crafted, and it worked. For centuries, her image was shaped not by truth, but by Roman lies. Playwrights, poets, and later even Shakespeare carried this vision forward. The Cleopatra of history, brilliant, strategic, commanding, was replaced by the Cleopatra of myth, a figure reduced to her relationships with men, her intellect buried beneath layers of scandal. But fragments of the real queen still survive. In the records of her rule, we see a leader who kept Egypt prosperous, who maintained its independence longer than anyone thought possible. In her alliances, we see not romance alone, but tactical brilliance, binding herself to Rome's most powerful figures. In her end, we see defiance. When defeat was certain, when Octavian sought to parade her as a trophy in Rome, she chose her own death. With dignity, she denied him his triumph. Even in death, she outmaneuvered him. Cleopatra's true story is one of erasure, not the erasure of her name or her memory, but the erasure of her truth. Rome could not destroy her legacy entirely, so it rewrote it. It reshaped her into a cautionary tale, a weaponized myth, and that is why the story of Cleopatra still matters, because it reveals how easily power can distort memory, how quickly a woman's brilliance can be buried beneath lies, how even a queen can be silenced by the pen of her enemies. When you strip away the propaganda, you see not a temptress, but a monarch standing against impossible odds. You see a woman who commanded fleets, who balanced alliances, who shaped history not with seduction, but with intellect. You see a queen who was far more dangerous than Rome admitted, not because of her beauty, but because of her mind. The Cleopatra we know is not the Cleopatra who lived, and perhaps that is the greatest cover-up of all. Across the sands of Egypt carved into stone lie the king lists, records of rulers stretching back thousands of years, etched into temples and monuments, chronicling dynasties that shaped one of history's greatest civilizations. They were meant to be permanent, eternal, unbroken. Yet when we study them closely, we find gaps, names missing, rulers erased, pharaohs who reigned but were later struck from memory, as though they had never lived. These are the missing pharaohs, ghosts of history, deliberately forgotten. The most famous example comes from the Abydos king list, carved in the temple of Seti Vyas. 76 kings are recorded in sequence, but not all who ruled appear. Entire dynasties are absent. Pharaohs considered illegitimate, heretical, or dangerous were removed. Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most powerful queens, is not there. Akhenaten, the pharaoh who worshipped Aten alone, is not there. Tutankhamun, who restored the old gods, is missing as well. To the scribes of Seti, these rulers were not kings to be remembered, but names to be erased. Why? Because memory was power in ancient Egypt. To be remembered was to live forever, to be spoken of by future generations. To be erased was a second death, a deliberate cutting away of your soul from eternity. For rulers who challenged tradition, who defied the gods, or who fell into disgrace, erasure was worse than defeat. It was annihilation. Hatshepsut's case is striking. She reigned as pharaoh in her own right, building magnificent temples and presiding over a time of peace and prosperity. Yet, after her death, her stepson Thutmose III sought to wipe her from history. Her statues were smashed, her images defaced, her name chiseled away. For centuries, her reign was almost invisible, until archaeologists uncovered the ruins that bore her mark. Why was she erased? Because she was a woman who ruled like a king. Her memory was too dangerous, too unsettling for later generations. Akhenaten suffered a similar fate. His revolution, his worship of Aten, was so offensive to Egypt's priests and rulers that they sought to destroy his legacy entirely. His city was abandoned, his monuments torn down, his name stricken from the lists. Even his son Tutankhamun, who undid his reforms, was not spared. The line of Amarna was condemned to silence. Their memory was a threat, and so it was buried. But these were not the only missing pharaohs. Scholars have noted that entire periods of Egyptian history seem hazy, incomplete. Records from the so-called Second Intermediate Period, when the Hyksos ruled parts of Egypt, are fragmentary at best. Were native rulers deliberately excluded? Were the foreign kings erased because their reigns were seen as illegitimate? Even the Turin Papyrus, one of the most complete records we have, is damaged, leaving tantalizing hints of rulers whose names are lost. This raises a haunting possibility. How much of Egypt's true history has been hidden by its own hands? We often imagine history as being lost to fire, flood, or time, but in Egypt, much of it was erased deliberately. What does it mean that some pharaohs were judged unworthy of memory? Were they failures, heretics, or did they uncover truths too dangerous for later dynasties to preserve? The missing pharaohs remind us that history is not neutral. It is a story written by those in power, edited to serve their vision of the world. Seti. I wanted a clean, unbroken line of kings to legitimize his rule. That meant leaving out those who did not fit the story, but the erasures themselves tell us something important. They reveal who was feared, who was resented, who challenged the order so deeply that their very existence became a threat. And yet, erasure is never complete. Fragments of Hatshepsut's statues survived, enough to piece together her reign. The ruins of Akhenaten's city still whisper his name. The boy king Tutankhamun, erased from the lists, was rediscovered in his golden tomb, one of the most famous archaeological finds in history. The missing pharaohs may have been silenced in their own time, but their voices still find us across the centuries. To stand before the Abydos king list is to see more than a record of rulers. It is to see absence made visible, to trace the gaps, the spaces where names should be, and to realize that these gaps are not accidents. They are choices, choices that reveal as much about Egypt's fears as its triumphs, choices that remind us how fragile memory can be and how easily it can be rewritten. The missing pharaohs still haunt us. They remind us that behind every monument, every inscription, there is a decision about what to remember and what to forget. And sometimes, what is forgotten may be the most important truth of all. Deep in the jungles of Mexico, long before the Aztecs built their empire, and centuries before the Maya charted the heavens, there lived a mysterious people we now call the Olmecs. They are often referred to as the mother civilization of Mesoamerica, the seed from which later cultures grew. And yet, despite their importance, the Olmecs remain an enigma. Their cities have crumbled into ruin. Their language is undeciphered. Their gods are veiled in shadows. What survives are fragments, stone heads with haunting faces, altars carved with cryptic symbols, and a legacy that seems too advanced, too strange to belong to a people we barely know. The most iconic relics of the Olmecs are their colossal heads, massive stone sculptures, some weighing up to 40 tons, carved with astonishing detail. Each face is unique, with helmets, wide noses, full lips, and an intensity that transcends time. Who were these figures? Kings, warriors, gods? Their scale alone suggests reverence, power, something beyond ordinary remembrance. To carve them, the Olmecs transported volcanic stone across vast distances, a feat of logistics that even now seems daunting. Why invest so much in faces carved from rock? And why did these heads survive when so much else was lost? Archaeologists tell us the Olmecs thrived between 1500 and 400 BCE. Their cities, like San Lorenzo and La Venta, reveal complex societies with ceremonial centers, monumental architecture, and advanced understanding of astronomy. They developed art styles that influenced later civilizations, from jaguar motifs to sacred altars. They may have invented the Mesoamerican ball game, a ritual sport played for centuries after. They cultivated maize, traded jade, obsidian, and cacao. And yet, for all their achievements, the Olmecs left behind no deciphered texts. Their voices remained silent. It is in this silence that mystery grows. Where did they come from? Some suggest they emerged locally, evolving out of earlier villages. Others wonder if their sudden complexity points to outside influence, perhaps even a lost civilization feeding knowledge into their culture. Their colossal heads, with features unlike later Mesoamerican art, have fueled endless speculation. Were they portraits of real rulers? Were they meant to preserve lineages we no longer know? Or do they represent something more, figures whose identities were deliberately hidden, obscured by time and intention? What makes the Olmecs even more puzzling is how abruptly they vanish. Around 400 BCE, their great cities decline. La Venta is abandoned, its monuments defaced and buried under layers of earth. Was this intentional, a ritual closing of an era? Or was it destruction by enemies who wanted to erase them? The archaeological record hints at upheaval, at violence, at forces that ended their dominance. And yet, their influence lingered. The Maya, the Aztecs, and others borrowed symbols, deities and practices that seemed to echo Olmec roots. It is as though the Olmecs did not disappear but were absorbed into the cultures that followed. Still, Their name, their identity, was lost. Some scholars believe the Olmecs were among the first to map the stars in Mesoamerica, aligning their ceremonial centers with celestial patterns. If true, it suggests a level of sophistication that rivals their successors. Yet why was so much of this knowledge buried with them? Were their astronomical insights dangerous to later powers, suppressed to preserve new religious orders? Or was their wisdom simply forgotten, buried, under centuries of conquest and collapse? The cover-up of the Olmecs is subtle, but powerful. Unlike Akhenaten, whose memory was deliberately destroyed, the Olmecs seem to have been swallowed by silence. Their achievements survived, but their names and voices did not. We know their art, but not their words. We see their monuments, but not the meaning. And in those colossal heads we are confronted with faces that seem to stare back at us, asking questions we cannot answer. Perhaps this is why the Olmecs haunt us. They are both origin and absence, a people who laid foundations but left no map. Their disappearance invites speculation, their monuments demand interpretation, their silence fuels myth. Were they simply the first chapter of Mesoamerican history? Or were they guardians of truths deliberately erased, truths too dangerous to survive conquest and empire? The Olmecs remind us that civilizations are not only lost through ruin, but through silence. When language fades, when memory is severed, a people can vanish even while their stones remain. And so we look at the colossal heads, carved with such care and wonder. Did the Olmecs intend these monuments to outlast their names? Did they know they would be forgotten, and leave these faces as their final message to the future? The Olmec enigma is not just about who they were, it is about what we have chosen not to remember. And in that forgetting, they remain both ancient and eternal, still watching us from the jungles where their faces sleep in stone. They lived in the forests and hills of ancient Europe, a people whose voices were never written down, but whose presence was felt in every ritual, every whisper of the wind through sacred groves. The Druids, guardians of wisdom, keepers of law, interpreters of the divine, they guided the Celts, presided over ceremonies, passed down traditions, and served as the living memory of their people. And yet, almost everything we know of them comes not from their own words, but from the pens of their enemies. Rome conquered their lands, burned their groves, and silenced their teachings. The Druids became shadows, half-remembered figures whose wisdom was buried beneath centuries of suppression. The Celts themselves were never a single empire. They were tribes spread across Europe, from Ireland and Britain to Gaul, and even into the fringes of the Mediterranean. What unified them was not a throne or an army, but a culture, a language, and at the centre of it all, the Druids. These men and women were not only priests, but judges, healers, poets, and philosophers. They held no written texts, for their wisdom was passed orally, generation to generation, guarded as sacred knowledge. To them, memory was more enduring than parchment. But to Rome, this secrecy was intolerable. When Julius Caesar encountered the Druids in Gaul, he described them with both fascination and fear. He wrote of their training, how it could take 20 years to master their teachings. He noted their role in human sacrifice, though some scholars believe this was Roman propaganda meant to portray them as barbaric. He acknowledged their influence, how they could rally tribes, resolve disputes, and stir resistance against invaders. To Rome, the Druids were dangerous not because of their rituals, but because of their power over hearts and minds. And so, the Romans sought to erase them. They outlawed their practices. They cut down their sacred groves. They waged war not just on Celtic warriors, but on the Druids themselves. On the island of Anglesey, in what is now Wales, Roman legions attacked a stronghold of Druids. Ancient writers describe how the Druids stood on the shore chanting curses, while women in black robes raised torches, and the forest echoed with cries. The Romans slaughtered them and set fire to their sanctuaries. In that moment something profound was lost. A lineage of wisdom that had stretched for generations was severed. What exactly did the Druids know? That is the question that haunts us. Some believe they carried deep knowledge of astronomy, tracking the movements of the stars with precision rivaling later civilizations. Stone circles like Stonehenge, though older than the Druids, may have been used or reinterpreted by them as sacred calendars. Others think the Druids were philosophers, pondering questions of the soul, the afterlife, and the nature of the cosmos. Caesar himself wrote that they believed in reincarnation, teaching that death was only a passage to another life. Their view of existence was cyclical, eternal, a wisdom that challenged the linear narratives of Rome. But because they left no writings, their true teachings were vulnerable. What survived were the distortions of outsiders, the Greeks who romanticized them as noble sages, the Romans who vilified them as bloodthirsty mystics, and later Christian monks who folded them into myths and legends. By the time the Middle Ages arrived, the Druids had become figures of folklore, more myth than memory, and yet their shadow lingers. In Celtic art, in the rhythms of ancient festivals that survived into Christian traditions, in the sacred reverence for trees, rivers, and stones, in stories of Merlin, who some say is a memory of a druidic figure recast into Arthurian legend, the silence around them is itself telling. Knowledge that once shaped a people was deliberately suppressed, buried by empire, and reshaped into something unrecognizable. The story of the Druids is not just a story of conquest, but of erasure. Rome could not simply defeat the Celts. It had to cut out their heart, sever their connection to wisdom and tradition. By destroying the Druids, Rome destroyed the memory keepers of an entire culture, and in doing so, it ensured that we would forever wonder who the Druids truly were. Even today, standing among the mist-covered stones of Britain or in the green forests of Ireland, you can feel their absence like a weight in the air. An echo of voices silenced long ago, a reminder that knowledge once buried may never return, but its ghost lingers in the land, in the stories, in the stars. The Druids remind us of how fragile wisdom is and how easily it can be erased when the conquerors control the story. They are a testament to a truth older than Rome, that memory is power, and those who hold it are always the first to be silenced. Across the deserts of southern Peru stretch lines so vast they can only be fully seen from the air. Straight lines cutting across the earth, geometric shapes spiraling into infinity, and vast figures of animals and beings drawn across the desert floor. A monkey with a curling tail, a hummingbird with wings outstretched, a spider, a condor, even what looks like a strange humanoid figure with enormous eyes. These are the Nazca lines, mysteries etched into the earth more than 1,500 years ago. To walk among them is to see nothing more than shallow furrows in the dust. But from above their enormity becomes clear. They were not made to be seen by those standing on the ground. They were made for the sky. The Nazca people created these geoglyphs between 500 BCE and 500 CE, long before flight as we know it existed. The sheer scale is staggering, hundreds of lines spanning more than 200 square miles. The question that has haunted researchers for decades is simple. Why? Why would a people who had no means of flying create images that could only be understood from above? One theory suggests they were ritual paths, walked by priests during ceremonies meant to honor the gods or summon rain. In a desert as dry as the Nazca Plain, water was life itself. Perhaps the lines were prayers written upon the earth, vast offerings of devotion etched into the dust. Others believe the figures represented sacred animals, guardians of fertility, rain, and survival. By carving them into the desert floor, the Nazca people may have been ensuring balance between the heavens and the earth. But then there are the stranger interpretations. The fact that the geoglyphs can only truly be appreciated from the sky has led some to wonder, were they messages not for humans, but for gods, or perhaps something else that watched from above? Ancient astronaut theorists see in the Nazca lines a landing strip, a signal, a communication across the stars. While mainstream scholars caution against such ideas, the sheer mystery of the lines continues to invite speculation. What we do know is that the lines were made with remarkable precision. By scraping away the dark oxidized surface of the desert to reveal the lighter soil beneath, the Nazca created images that have lasted for centuries, preserved by the arid climate. Some figures span hundreds of feet, and they were drawn with a level of accuracy that suggests knowledge of geometry, measurement, and perhaps even astronomy. Some researchers argue the lines align with solstices, equinoxes, and the rising and setting of stars. Could the desert itself have been a giant calendar, a map linking heaven and earth? Then there is the question of their survival. Why did the Nazca people invest so much effort into something so enormous, so invisible from the ground? Was it faith alone, or was there something in their worldview that made visibility irrelevant? Perhaps they believed the gods could see what they themselves could not. Perhaps that was the point. The erasure of the Nazca is part of the mystery. By the time the Spanish arrived in Peru, the people who made the lines were long gone, their culture absorbed into others, their voices silenced. No written records explain the purpose of the geoglyphs. What survives are only the lines themselves, silent, sprawling, and haunting in their persistence. The desert has preserved their message, but the meaning has been stripped away. It is as though someone tore the pages from a book, leaving only the illustrations. Standing before the lines today, even with modern technology, we are no closer to certainty. Theories abound, but answers remain elusive, and perhaps that is the true cover-up, not one imposed by empire or fire, but by time itself. The sands of the desert have hidden the intentions of the Nazca as surely as Rome hid the Druids, or as Egypt erased Akhenaten. What remains is an echo, a puzzle that refuses to be solved. The Nazca lines remind us that human beings have always reached beyond themselves, carving meaning into landscapes that endure long after the people who made them vanish. They are a message without words, a text without language, a story etched into the earth for someone, somewhere, to see. And as the planes fly overhead, and the figures emerge in their full glory, we are left to wonder, who were they written for? And why do they still call to us across the silence of centuries? The city of Carthage once stood as a jewel of the Mediterranean, a rival to Rome, a beacon of wealth and trade, and a power that nearly changed the fate of history itself. Its harbours welcomed ships from across the known world. Its merchants commanded riches from Africa, Spain, and beyond. Its generals, like the legendary Hannibal, shook the very foundations of Rome with campaigns so daring they remain unmatched in military history. And yet, today, Carthage exists only in ruins, its memory reduced to whispers and ashes. For Rome did not merely defeat Carthage, it sought to erase it. The story of Carthage is one of brilliance and betrayal. Founded by Phoenician settlers, it grew from a small colony into a sprawling empire. Its navy dominated the seas, its markets overflowed with goods, its walls stretched wide and high. Carthage was a city of innovation and prosperity, but also of ambition, and that ambition brought it into collision with Rome. The Punic Wars that followed would last more than a century, a brutal struggle for dominance of the Mediterranean. Hannibal Barca, the greatest of Carthaginian generals, became a name Rome would never forget. He led his army, including war elephants, across the Alps, a feat so audacious it seemed impossible. For years he ravaged Italy, defeating Roman armies again and again. Rome trembled under his shadow, and yet Carthage did not give him the full support he needed. Eventually, Hannibal was forced back, and Rome struck Carthage itself. The Second Punic War ended with Carthage humbled, its power broken but not yet destroyed. Rome, however, could not let Carthage live. To the Romans, Carthage was a threat as long as it existed. And so, in the Third Punic War, they came with fire and vengeance. For 3 years they besieged the city. Carthage resisted fiercely, its citizens fighting street by street, house by house. But Rome's legions were relentless. Finally, in 146 BCE, the city fell. the Romans slaughtered its people, enslaved the survivors, and set fire to the city. Ancient writers claimed the destruction was so complete that Rome salted the earth, ensuring nothing would grow again. Whether this detail is myth or fact, the symbolism is undeniable. Carthage was not just defeated, it was erased. What makes this erasure so haunting is what we lost with it. Carthage was the center of knowledge, culture, and trade. Its libraries, its art, its archives, all burned. We know almost nothing of Carthage from Carthaginian voices. What survives are the words of their enemies, the Romans, who painted them as cruel, barbaric, sacrificing their own children to gods of fire. Was this truth or propaganda? We may never know, for the Carthaginians' own stories were reduced to ash. A people who once stood toe to toe with Rome now speak only through the words of those who destroyed them. This is the cover-up of Carthage, the silencing of a civilization through fire and conquest. Rome not only wanted victory, it wanted memory itself to be on its terms, and it succeeded. For centuries, to speak of Carthage was to speak of Rome's triumph, Rome's destiny, Rome's greatness. The reality of Carthage, the lives of its citizens, the wisdom of its thinkers, the voices of its poets, was consumed in flame. And yet, beneath the ashes, fragments remain. Archaeologists have uncovered temples, harbours and homes that whisper of Carthage's splendour. Inscriptions, coins and ruins hint at a people far more complex than Rome allowed us to remember. Slowly the city is being pieced back together, but the silence imposed by fire still lingers. It is as though Carthage is a ghost reaching across time, asking us to hear its story not as Rome told it, but as it truly was. The destruction of Carthage is a reminder of how history is written not by the victors, but by the survivors of victory. Rome ensured that Carthage would not survive, and so its story became Rome's story. And in that silence we see not just the fall of a city, but the deliberate erasure of a civilization. To stand among the ruins of Carthage today is to feel both awe and grief. Awe at what it once was, and grief for all that was lost. The fire that consumed it still burns in memory, a warning of how easily a culture can be wiped away when those with power decide it should vanish. Carthage may have fallen, but its ashes remind us of the cost of silence and the fragility of truth. In the heart of southern Africa lie the ruins of stone walls, towers, and enclosures that rise from the earth with a quiet majesty. They are known as the Great Zimbabwe, a vast complex built between the 11th and 15th centuries. Once it was the thriving center of a powerful kingdom, a hub of trade that reached as far as China and the Middle East. Gold, ivory, and precious goods flowed through its walls. Its rulers commanded respect across the continent, and yet, for centuries, its very existence was denied. Not simply forgotten, but deliberately erased from the narrative of history. The Great Zimbabwe stands as one of the most impressive archaeological sites in Africa. Massive stone walls constructed without mortar rise in graceful curves, enclosing spaces that once held palaces and temples. The craftsmanship is undeniable, the scale awe-inspiring. At its height, the city may have housed up to 20,000 people. It was the seat of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, a civilization rooted in African soil, built by African hands. And yet, when Europeans stumbled upon these ruins in the 19th century, they could not, or rather would not, believe that Africans had created them. Colonial explorers and scholars, steeped in prejudice, insisted that the Great Zimbabwe must have been built by outsiders. Some claimed it was the work of Phoenicians, others of Arabs, even of ancient Hebrews. The idea that the ancestors of the people living nearby could have constructed such a complex was dismissed as impossible. This denial was not simply ignorance. It was part of a larger cover-up, a rewriting of history meant to justify colonial rule. If Africa was seen as a land without its own advanced civilizations, then its conquest and exploitation could be framed as progress rather than theft. For decades, this false narrative was upheld. Early archaeologists who presented evidence of African authorship were silenced or ignored. The ruins themselves were manipulated to fit colonial myths, their artifacts selectively interpreted or removed. The Great Zimbabwe became not a monument to African achievement, but a stage for European imagination. It was a theft not only of land, but of memory, of dignity, of truth. But the stones themselves tell another story. The walls, built with precise stonework, curve and interlock in patterns unique to the region. The artifacts found within, pottery, tools, trade goods, belong unmistakably to local cultures. And the very name Zimbabwe comes from the Shona language, meaning house of stone. This was no foreign colony. It was a city of Africans, built by their vision, their labour, their ingenuity. The cover-up of the Great Zimbabwe reveals how dangerous history can be when controlled by those in power. To deny a people their past is to strip them of identity, to weaken their claim to sovereignty. For the colonial rulers of Rhodesia, as Zimbabwe was once called, it was essential to maintain the lie. Only when African voices could no longer be suppressed did the truth begin to resurface. Today, Great Zimbabwe is a national symbol, its ruins a reminder of a legacy that endured despite attempts to erase it. And yet, the scars of that erasure remain. Much of the site's history is still shrouded in mystery, its full story fragmented by centuries of denial. The silence imposed by colonial cover-ups still echoes, making it harder to reconstruct the vibrant life that once thrived there. What knowledge, what stories, what wisdom was lost in that silence? Standing among the stone walls today, you feel both wonder and sorrow. Wonder at the genius of its builders, sorrow at the lies that sought to strip it away. The Great Zimbabwe is more than ruins. It is a testament to resilience. It stands as proof that civilizations can rise in any land, that genius is not confined to one continent or one people. It is also a reminder of how easily history can be stolen, reshaped, or buried. The stones remain, silent, steadfast. They tell a story that no empire, no prejudice, no lie could truly erase. The Great Zimbabwe stands as a monument not just to the past but to the endurance of truth. It whispers across the centuries. We were here, we built, we thrived, and no matter how many tried to cover it up, our legacy endures in the house of stone. High on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, where the cliffs rise like stone sentinels above the valley below, there once stood a temple that the ancient world regarded as the very navel of the earth. It was here that mortals sought the voice of the gods, here that kings, warriors, and philosophers travelled across seas and deserts to hear a single whisper from the divine. This was Delphi, the sanctuary of Apollo, home to the oracle whose words could shape the fate of empires. And yet, for all its glory, its power, its sacred mystery, the voice of Delphi has fallen silent, its echoes lost, its secrets buried, its memory carefully managed by those who wrote history in their own image. To understand Delphi is to understand the power of belief. Within the temple of Apollo sat the Pythia, a priestess who entered trances induced, some say, by vapours rising from the earth. In that altered state, she spoke words that were believed to come directly from Apollo himself. These utterances were often cryptic, layered in riddles and ambiguity, but they held the weight of destiny. Rulers consulted her before wars. Colonists sought her blessing before founding new cities. Ordinary people asked her about harvests, marriages, and journeys. For centuries, her voice was considered the bridge between the human and the divine. The influence of the oracle at Delphi cannot be overstated. The Persian Wars, the rise of Athens, the expansion of Sparta, all were touched by the Pythia's words. Her guidance shaped alliances, determined strategies, and offered legitimacy to those who ruled. Yet her riddles also left room for interpretation, allowing those in power to bend her voice to their own ends. And in this lies the first layer of cover-up. The oracle's words were rarely recorded in her own voice. They were written down, shaped, and sometimes altered by the priests who surrounded her, men who controlled access to the sacred space. In this way, prophecy was never entirely pure. It was filtered, reshaped, and sometimes manipulated to serve human agendas. But the greater erasure came later. As Christianity rose and the old gods were cast aside, Delphi was silenced. The temple fell into ruin, the rituals ended, the Pythia's voice dismissed as superstition or sorcery. The sanctuary that had once been the centre of the Greek world became rubble, its stones repurposed, its memory reduced to fragments. For centuries, Delphi's significance was buried beneath layers of disdain, its sacred history overshadowed by the triumph of a new faith. Even today, scholars debate the truth of what happened within those walls. Were the Pythia's visions truly inspired by divine presence, or were they the result of geological gases rising from fissures in the rock? Was she channeling something beyond the human mind, or was it simply a natural phenomenon reinterpreted by a culture steeped in myth? The ambiguity itself is part of the mystery, part of the veil that time has drawn across her story. What is undeniable is the power Delphi once held. It was not merely a religious site, but a political one, a place where belief and governance intertwined. And like so many centers of power, its story has been rewritten, its memory reshaped. The silencing of the oracle is not only the silence of a woman's voice, but the silencing of an entire worldview, an erasure of the sacred bond that ancient peoples believed tied them to the divine. Walking the ruins today, you see scattered columns, fragments of marble, the remnants of a theatre that once rang with hymns to Apollo. You stand on sacred ground, but the voice that once gave it life is gone. The wind moves through the stones, carrying only echoes. The Pythia's prophecies, once the heartbeat of nations, are now only lines in ancient texts, texts filtered, shaped, and passed down by those with their own agendas. The oracle herself has no surviving words of her own. This is Delphi's cover-up, the silencing of prophecy, the reduction of a sacred voice to a historical footnote, the loss of a woman's power in a world where men held the pens that wrote history. Yet the ruins still breathe with mystery. They remind us that there was once a time when the divine was not locked in books or bound to dogma, but alive in the voice of a woman seated in the shadows, inhaling the breath of the earth and speaking in riddles that still haunt us. The oracle at Delphi may be silent, but her absence is a presence all its own, a silence heavy with meaning, a reminder that even when voices are buried, the questions they raise continue to echo through time. The streets of London in the year 1666 were a labyrinth of timber houses, narrow alleys and crowded marketplaces. It was a city alive with noise and movement, but also one sitting on a powder keg of danger. The summer had been long and dry, the wind carried sparks with ease, and when the first flames rose in the bakery of Thomas Fariner on Pudding Lane, no one could have predicted how quickly the fire would spread. What followed was not just the destruction of a city, but the rewriting of its memory, a cover-up hidden in the smoke and ash of the Great Fire of London. For 4 days the fire raged, roofs collapsed, churches crumbled. Entire neighbourhoods were reduced to charred skeletons of wood and stone. The blaze leapt from street to street with terrifying speed, consuming homes, warehouses, and markets. Nearly 90% of the medieval city vanished. By the time the flames were finally extinguished, London was transformed into a wasteland of smouldering ruins. The destruction was immense, and yet, curiously, the official death toll was reported as almost non-existent. Could an inferno of such magnitude truly have claimed so few lives? Or was the truth buried along with the bodies? The fire became more than a disaster, it became an opportunity. For some, it was a chance to rebuild. For others, it was a chance to shift blame. Almost immediately, whispers began to spread about the fire's cause. Was it an accident, a spark from Fariner's oven, or was it something more sinister? Foreigners, Catholics, and outsiders were accused, beaten, even executed in the chaos. A Frenchman named Robert Hubert confessed under questionable circumstances to setting the fire and was hanged. Yet his confession made little sense. He admitted to starting the fire in a location the blaze had never reached. His execution satisfied the public's thirst for blame, but did little to explain the truth. Behind the scenes, the fire served powerful interests. The medieval city had been overcrowded, unsanitary, and prone to plague. The destruction, though tragic, cleared the way for a new London, one of wider streets, grander buildings, and stricter order. Architects like Sir Christopher Wren envisioned a city of stone and symmetry rising from the ashes. For the monarchy, still reeling from political instability, the fire became a chance to reassert control. But what of the voices of those who suffered? Their losses were immense, their homes and livelihoods erased, yet their stories are scarcely recorded. The official records of the Great Fire are curiously neat, the narrative streamlined, the chaos and horror smoothed into the story of a city reborn. The deaths of the poor, the dispossessed, and the voiceless were minimized, their suffering written out of history. The fire itself became mythologized, a divine punishment, a cleansing flame, a rebirth. The messier truths, the scapegoating of foreigners, the questionable execution, the possibility of negligence or even deliberate destruction were left smouldering in silence. Even centuries later, questions remain. Could the fire have been prevented? Was its cause truly accidental? Why was the loss of life so drastically underreported? Archaeologists uncovering mass graves suggest the death toll may have been far higher than acknowledged, and the strange convenience of the fire for those who wished to reshape London leaves a shadow of doubt. Was it fate, or was it a cover-up, one that rewrote disaster into opportunity? Today, the monument to the Great Fire rises high above London, a column of stone that commemorates both destruction and rebirth. Tourists climb its steps, gazing over a city that rose from ashes into modernity. But the monument tells only one story, the story of resilience, of rebuilding, of progress. It does not speak of the forgotten dead, of the foreign scapegoats, of the silenced poor who lost everything and were written out of history. The flames that tore through London did more than consume buildings, they consumed memory. They left behind not just ruins, but questions. Questions buried beneath the neat narrative of renewal. In the fire's silence lies a reminder that history is not only about what happened, but about what we are allowed to remember. The Great Fire of London stands as both a tragedy and a cover-up, a blaze that destroyed a city and in doing so gave those in power the chance to reshape not just streets and walls, but the very story of London itself. Beneath the golden sands of Egypt lie secrets that even time has not been able to fully bury. For every tomb unearthed in the Valley of the Kings, for every sarcophagus carefully displayed in a museum, there are whispers of others, lost pharaohs whose final resting places were hidden, plundered, or erased. Egypt, the land that prided itself on preserving the dead for eternity, holds within it the strange irony of rulers denied their place in memory. These are the lost pharaohs, kings whose names have been rubbed from stone, whose tombs lie in silence, their existence obscured by the shifting sands of time and the deliberate choices of those who came after them. We think of Egypt as eternal, its monuments indestructible, its pyramids and temples unyielding to the ages. And yet, much of what survives is only fragments of a much larger tapestry. Ancient Egypt lasted for thousands of years, dynasties rising and falling like the floods of the Nile. Entire chapters of that story are missing. Some pharaohs we know only from faint inscriptions, half-erased hieroglyphs or references carved into other monuments. Others are little more than names on lists stripped of the tombs and treasures that would have secured their immortality. Why were they forgotten? Some were victims of time and chance. Their tombs collapsed, were looted, or remain undiscovered. But others were deliberately erased. When Akhenaten introduced his radical monotheism, worshipping only the sun disk Aten, his successors fought to bury his memory. His statues were shattered, his temples dismantled, his name chiseled from stone. Later rulers attempted to erase him so thoroughly that for centuries he was nothing more than a shadow, a heretic pharaoh spoken of only in whispers. This practice of erasure, known as damnatio memoriae, was not unique to Akhenaten. Pharaohs who fell out of favor or who threatened the legitimacy of their successors often suffered the same fate. Hatshepsut, the great female pharaoh who ruled with wisdom and ambition, was nearly erased by her stepson, Thutmose III. Her statues were destroyed, her name effaced, her image replaced with his own. For centuries, her reign was hidden, her achievements credited to others. Only in recent decades has archaeology begun to restore her to her rightful place in history. But the mystery deepens when we consider the tombs themselves. The Valley of the Kings holds 63 known tombs, but scholars believe more remain undiscovered. Scans beneath the sands have hinted at hidden chambers, voids that could hold treasures or rulers long forgotten. The possibility that the tomb of Nefertiti lies undiscovered haunts Egyptology to this day. Even more tantalizing is the thought of pharaohs we do not even know to search for, names erased so thoroughly that their very existence is a secret. And then there are the tombs denied entirely. In times of political upheaval, some rulers were never granted the elaborate burial they desired. Their reigns ended too quickly, their wealth too depleted, or their enemies too strong. They were laid to rest in hurried graves, their memory unmarked. To the ancient Egyptians, this was not just dishonor, it was annihilation. To be forgotten was to die a second death, one from which there was no return. The sands of Egypt conceal more than stone. They conceal stories. They conceal the deliberate manipulations of memory, the way rulers sought to control not only their own legacies, but those of their enemies. Each missing tomb is not only an archaeological mystery, but a political one. Each erasure was an act of power, a rewriting of history by those who survived. Today, tourists wander through the painted corridors of Tutankhamun's tomb, marveling at the treasures that survived untouched for millennia. But for every Tutankhamun, there are others who have nothing, no chamber, no mask, no gold. Their silence is deafening. Their absence is as much a message as the presence of those we remember. The lost pharaohs remind us that history is never whole. It is a patchwork of what was preserved and what was destroyed, of who was remembered and who was erased. Somewhere beneath the desert, perhaps, a sealed door waits. Behind it could lie the name of a king forgotten, a queen erased, a story long denied. Until that moment, we are left with whispers. Whispers of rulers who once commanded empires, now vanished into silence, their immortality stolen, their tombs denied to history. The story of history is never finished. For every monument uncovered, every scroll deciphered, every inscription translated, there are 1,000 more secrets buried in the shadows. Entire civilizations have slipped through the cracks of memory, leaving behind only fragments, scattered like broken pottery in the sand. And behind those fragments lies a silence carefully maintained, a silence that whispers of truths we were never meant to know. The greatest cover-up is not a single lost city, not a vanished people, not even a library burned to ash. The greatest cover-up is the way history itself is written. It is shaped by victors, guarded by priests, controlled by rulers who decide what will be remembered and what will be erased. And in that shaping, vast truths are hidden. Entire lifetimes are swallowed by silence. Whole cultures are reduced to footnotes, prophecies are dismissed, knowledge is forgotten not by accident but by design. Think of what lies beneath our feet at this very moment. Across deserts, jungles and oceans, there are ruins yet untouched, temples waiting to be uncovered, tombs sealed by stone and sand. The earth hides more than it reveals. Satellites have revealed ghostly outlines of lost cities buried beneath the Amazon rainforest. The sands of the Sahara conceal evidence of rivers and settlements that predate our understanding of history. Beneath the waves of the Mediterranean, entire ports and palaces lie sunken, their stories locked away in silence. These are not just accidents of time, they are reminders that history is still unfolding, that we live surrounded by secrets. But there is another silence, one crafted by intention, records destroyed, languages lost, stories rewritten, voices silenced. The scribes of empires chose which names to carve into stone, which battles to record, which gods to praise. What we call history is a selective memory, a narrow path cut through a much wider landscape. For every name we remember, Alexander, Caesar, Cleopatra, there are countless others erased, denied their place in the tapestry of time. Their erasure was not chance, it was power. And yet, the fragments remain. The broken tablets of Sumer still whisper of kings who reigned for thousands of years. The faded scrolls of Qumran still hint at hidden gospels and silenced voices. The carvings of Mesoamerica speak of visitors from the stars, of knowledge that surpasses what we think ancient peoples could know. These fragments are cracks in the wall of silence. They remind us that history's story is not complete, and perhaps never will be. What then is the final cover-up? It is the belief that the past is settled, that we know the truth, that the story has been told. In reality, the story is still alive, still shifting, still being pieced together by those who dare to question. Every discovery unsettles the narrative. Every ruin uncovered reminds us that the past is deeper and stranger than we were taught. Every silenced voice calls to us from the shadows, urging us to listen. As we close this journey, we are left with more questions than answers. What civilizations have we forgotten? What knowledge was burned in the flames of Alexandria? What rulers lie hidden in unmarked tombs? What voices were silenced because their truths were too dangerous, too disruptive, too powerful? The silence of history is not empty. It is full of secrets still buried, full of truths waiting to surface, full of reminders that the past is not gone, it is only hidden, and one day perhaps the earth itself will give up its secrets. One day the cover-ups will fail, and the voices buried for centuries will be heard again. Until then, we walk in the half-light of memory, piecing together fragments, haunted by what we do not know. History has always been a story of both revelation and concealment, and the greatest mystery of all is not what we have discovered, but what still lies buried, just beyond our reach, waiting to be uncovered. The secrets of the ancients are still out there. They are watching us, calling to us, hidden in stone, sand, and silence. And perhaps if we listen closely enough, we may yet hear their voices again. Then let this journey end not in silence, but in invitation. If the shadows of history have stirred something within you, if these mysteries have made you wonder what else has been hidden, erased, or rewritten, then do not let the story end here. There are more voices waiting, more secrets buried, more truths that refuse to stay forgotten. Stay with us. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next step into the unknown. Share this journey with others who hunger for the same questions, who crave the same discoveries. Leave your thoughts in the comments. What did you hear in these stories? What mysteries still call to you? Your voice keeps this search alive, and above all, do not stop questioning. Do not stop listening. The past still speaks if we dare to hear it. So like this video, share it, comment, and subscribe. Together we'll keep uncovering the secrets that history tried to bury. Together we'll walk further into the silence until the silence finally breaks.